Hamilton South and Wigan by-elections. Results are expected in about an hour and a half. Early indications suggest that heavy rain and poor weather conditions have resulted in a low turnout. Well, let's go live now to our political correspondents, John Pienaar, who's at the count in Hamilton South, and Laura Trevelyan, who's at Wigan. John Pienaar, let's start with you. It's obviously very early days, just 6 minutes since the polls closed, but what's the feeling about which way the voting has gone today?
Well, you spoke earlier about the low turnout of voters, and I think that's pretty much going to be a large part of the picture later on here this evening. It was bad weather in Hamilton, then it improved a little bit, but they're talking now about a turnout in the range of something between sort of mid-30s and 40%, which is pretty low by most standards. So whatever happens, I don't think Labour can expect a thumping majority if they get the majority, which obviously they want to get, and which most of the polls and the pundits say they will get. So a fairly low-key result, Labour looking confident at this stage, but no one, I think, will have too much to jump up and down and cheer about.
To what extent is this election being viewed as an indicator of how well the political parties are doing in the new Scottish Parliament, do you think?
Well, to some extent, by-elections will inevitably be read, and one in this place at this time will be read in pretty much that kind of way. For Labour, we know they have a good deal to look at as they calculate their own figures. It's a mighty majority they're defending, just short of 16,000. It would be a seismic upset if they were to lose this seat with that kind of starting point. But as you say, since then we've got the Scottish Parliament, and we'll be watching very closely what happens to the SNP. Now, there's an interesting tactical point here. They've got the Scottish Parliament. Will people then think there's any need, any good reason to vote for the SNP for a parliamentary Westminster seat? Now that could do them a bit of damage as well.
And John, briefly, what time can we expect a declaration there?
Well, the officials here, the returning officers, seem very confident they're going to get a result something around 11:30, so not too very late at all.
Laura Trevelyan at Wigan, let me turn to you. What's the feeling there? How's voting been going there?
Well, apparently the turnout has been quite low, even though there's been really quite a high-profile campaign here with people like John Prescott and William Hague coming down to try and drum up support. Apparently there hasn't been that much enthusiasm for voting throughout the day, and officials think the turnout could be quite low, perhaps somewhere in the 20s. This is, of course, a very safe Labour seat. Labour held it with 22,000, majority of 22,000 at the last election. And the MP who died, Roger Stott, was very popular. So in a sense, there's no particular motivation for people to turn out. This isn't a hotly contested seat. But we should have the result probably around 12:30 and perhaps earlier if the turnout is very low.
However, we have seen some of the opposition big party guns getting in there, haven't they, in the campaigning?
Yes, that's right. Well, it's interesting having all the parties there. And as you can see, you know, the counting has just begun. We've got the first few ballot boxes coming in. And I think really what it is here in this seat is a test for Labour, whether they can actually get their voters out in what is very much a Labour heartland. You'll see throughout the night as the votes count up in the boxes behind me, just really how well Labour are doing. And I think that's what this by-election is about. It's about whether or not Labour can get a high turnout. Because, of course, just around the corner from here in Leeds Central back in June, there was the lowest turnout ever in peacetime, just 19.6%. So Labour will be hoping very much that the turnout here is higher than that.
And what time will we get a result there?
Probably around 12:30, but if the turnout is much lower, it could well be earlier. We'll certainly know what the turnout figure is at about 11 o'clock.
Laura Trevelyan there in Wigan and John Pienaar at Hamilton South. Thank you both very much indeed. And we'll of course have extended coverage of the results from both those by-elections here on BBC News 24 from 11 o'clock tonight.
Victims of one of...
You can see there, the polls closed at 10 o'clock and the early indication from both constituencies is that the turnout was low. One reason may be the bad weather. And we'll be bringing you the declarations live from both constituencies as we get them. So stay with us because at 11 o'clock we'll be bringing you a special election results programme.
Speaking of the bad...
We're live at the by-election counts in Hamilton South and in Wigan. Labour are defending big majorities in both constituencies. Hello, you're watching BBC News 24. I'm Matthew Amroliwala. We'll be bringing you extended live coverage of both those by-elections as the results come in.
And I'm Joanna Gosling. The other headlines at 11 o'clock. Tension is rising in East Timor. Shots have been fired close to British soldiers. Victims of one of Britain's worst water poisoning cases did suffer brain damage, according to a new report. And there's a new deal for junior doctors, more money and better hours.
Good evening and welcome to this by-election special. The counting has started in the by-elections in Hamilton South and in Wigan. In Scotland tonight, it's seen as the major test of public opinion since the formation of the new Parliament there in May. While in England, it's the first poll since the European elections in June. Labour currently holds both seats with big majorities. Turnout at both is expected to be low. We're expecting the Hamilton result in the next half an hour. A declaration from Wigan should also come within the next hour. So do stay with us. We'll have all the results, reaction and analysis here on BBC News 24. Well, after this by-election, the electorate in Hamilton will probably be hoping for a rest period free of anything political. In the last 2 years, voters have been to the polls on 5 different occasions, and keeping the interest of the electorate has proved quite hard.
It's not just Hamilton, it's not just this by-election. Politicians are finding it increasingly difficult to engage with the electorate.
They're all very dull, the candidates,
And
with one or two exceptions.
And by and large, their supporters are dull too.
Labour are probably favourites to get in, so people say, well, it'll be Labour, so we'll not bother.
I'd like to see everyone take an opportunity because a lot of folk fought to get this vote.
The parties have tried, they really have, to liven things up, but over 2 years these people have been asked to vote for Westminster, a Scottish referendum, a local council, a Scottish Parliament, the European Parliament, and now a by-election.
I think it's been low-key in by-election terms because simply we're all a bit scunnered of elections.
Part of the scunner factor, of course, could be that this election was only caused because Tony Blair chose to send George Robertson to NATO and the House of Lords.
And the reason for the election is the same. The local MP gets a good job and same reason.
But will it be the same result? The Nationalists dream of rerunning Winnie Ewing's 1967 victory here with her daughter Annabel as candidate. She slipped up by admitting that a Westminster seat was only her second preference. The Nationalists have fought hard, but say the media focus has been elsewhere.
The reality is it's been well fought on the ground, but because there's a Parliament in Scotland now too, a lot of the journalists have been away covering the Parliament.
Labour have shepherded their candidate, union official Bill Tynan, in line with recent practice, but they insist they've tried to counter the drift towards a low-key contest.
We've had the Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, the Chancellor's been here, the Foreign Secretary, the Defence Secretary, Donald Dewar, the First Minister, and myself.
Certainly voters have welcomed the chance for a word in the ear of Scotland's First Minister. And as the band played on, Donald Dewar voiced his discontent with an unnamed target.
Yeah, so dishonest.
Tommy Sheridan of the Scottish Socialists made his target very specific.
Put Labour on trial, find them guilty of dereliction of duty.
But for the Liberal Democrats and indeed the others, it's been a chase to catch voter interest so soon after the establishment of Scotland's new Parliament.
People's attention is by and large focused, looking at Edinburgh, looking at the new Holyrood Parliament and saying, well, what's happening there?
It's understandable that the skirmish of a by-election should assume less importance now that the political battleground of a Scottish Parliament is available. But thoughtful politicians fear there's a more general change underway. They used to persuade people to vote for them. Now, first, they have to persuade them to vote at all.
Exactly honest.
Well, that's the turnout. Our political correspondent John Pienaar is at the count at Hamilton Town Hall. And from Wigan, we're joined by correspondent Laura Trevelyan. John Pienaar, first there in Scotland. Any early indication as to how this is going?
Well, what we know now is that it's going to be the kind of lowish turnout that you've been discussing in the studio, maybe just over 40% or so, which by most by-election standards counts as not terribly impressive. And the reasons are fairly clear, I think, on a number of fronts. So many elections in the space of just 2.5 years. Scottish parliamentary elections, the European elections, local elections and other elections too. It doesn't exactly encourage people to flock to the polling stations in huge numbers. And this so soon after the Scottish parliamentary elections, well, you can see the kind of thing that's been happening.
And John, who does that help if it is a low turnout?
Well, I think it would be a seismic upset if Labour were to lose a seat of this kind with their whopping 16,000 majority at the last general election. And the SNP, I imagine, would be astonished itself to do anything of that kind. They would hope normally to run Labour reasonably tight in a by-election contest. They are after quite good at getting their own vote out in a single fight of this kind. But there were some fairly interesting and special circumstances where the SNP are concerned. We now have a Scottish Parliament. There has to be a reason for people to vote SNP for the Westminster Parliament, which even in the SNP's own eyes has that much of a lower priority. So the currents going against the SNP here, they'll look to do pretty much as well as they can.
Well, exactly on that point, even the candidate herself accepted that she would prefer to be in the Scottish Parliament rather than the Westminster Parliament. Have there been questions asked why they're bothering to fight the seat at all?
Well, I think it's pretty much necessary for the SNP to fight the seat. They are, after all, now the official opposition party in Scotland since the establishment and the elections to the Scottish Parliament. But those questions that you raise are perfectly legitimate. And it's not just the candidate for the SNP in this by-election. All the existing MPs at Westminster who stand for the SNP have made quite clear they're putting themselves into the Holyrood Parliament after the next election passes. So the Westminster Parliament has that much of a lower profile as far as SNP aspirations are concerned. The voters could be forgiven for treating the matter accordingly.
John, they're very quick to count there. We'll be back to you in maybe the next 15 or 20 minutes for that result. For now, thanks very much. Let's go to Laura Trevelyan there in Wigan. What early indications from there, Laura?
Well, we've just got the turnout, Matthew, just a few moments ago, and the turnout here in Wigan is 25%, which is pretty diabolical, although not quite as bad as it was at the Leeds Central by-election back in July, which was 19.6%. So it's higher than that, but not by much. And really what we're seeing now in elections really throughout this year is a very, very low turnout. 23% in the European elections and now another by-election with just 25%. And Labour obviously will be disappointed by that. They hold this seat by a whopping 22,000 majority. But one of the strategists here tonight was saying to me, we're hoping for a 30% turnout. Well, they only got 25%, which isn't great.
If Labour doesn't win this, enormous questions. I mean, it would have to be a seismic change in voting patterns for them not to win it. This is all about second place, isn't it?
That's right. I mean, Labour clearly will win, we imagine. Otherwise, we'll all look rather stupid. But yes, the Conservatives, interestingly, have mounted a very, very big campaign. One of the agent here tonight was saying to me, normally we ignore Wigan, you know, that's bad, we've done that in the past, but they've had a really big campaign. William Hague has been here, Michael Portillo has been here, 28 MPs were out campaigning with William Hague. So what they're really hoping to do is to boost their share of the vote. In 1997 they got 16% of the vote and they're hoping to push that right up. And the Liberal Democrats very much hoping not to be squeezed into a poor third, but you know, wondering what the impact will be of the United Kingdom Independence Party, who are also standing here and have also had a very, very big and powerful campaign. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, because often when you have a UK Independence Party candidate, they take votes from the Tories, but that may not be the case this time round.
OK, Laura Trevelyan there in Wigan. We'll be back to you. We're expecting that result in about an hour's time. When we get it, we'll be back to you there at the count. Well, here in the studio is Dr. John Bartle. He's from the Department of Government at Essex University. He'll be with us throughout this evening as we number crunch, as we expect these results to come in. Thanks very much for joining us this evening. What will you be looking for as these figures come in tonight?
Well, essentially only three things tonight. Although on paper these are fairly low-key by-elections, I think we can actually still extract some useful information. The first is clearly the swing between Labour and the SNP in Hamilton South, where Labour and the SNP are in a real fight for primary position in Scottish politics. The second thing I'm interested in is the swing between Labour and the Liberal Democrats in the Wigan seat. In the Leeds Central by-election recently, there was quite a substantial swing that went uncommented upon of 20% to the Liberal Democrats. And it would be interesting to see if a trend has been established where the Liberal Democrats become the primary opposition to Labour in the inner city areas that they've relied upon in the past. And finally, of course, turnout. It's very low.
Well, both constituencies have just told us very low. Who does that actually help, do you think, or does it help no one?
Well, we simply don't have the evidence. There could be differential turnout. One would suspect they were primarily Labour supporters who would stay at home. After all, the one thing they know is whether they vote today, whether they vote tomorrow or in the future, they will have a Labour government with an absolutely massive majority safe in Westminster.
Just going back to the Scottish by-election, the Hamilton South, it would take, I think, a 24% swing, wouldn't it, for the SNP to actually take that seat?
Yes, we've been using the word seismic, which is probably unfortunate given the recent events. But it would take a major turnabout of events, absolutely massive 24% swing. There are a few precedents which suggest that might happen. A recent one, 1988, was the Glasgow Govan seat, where curiously the sitting MP was appointed to be a commissioner in Europe. The electorate may have reacted against that and threw him out. And of course, Hamilton itself has history. The 1967 by-election, the SNP, standing for the first time in the constituency, obtained 47% of the vote. So the history is there for a surprise result.
Very briefly, both these constituencies are very similar Labour heartlands. There was criticism after the European elections that perhaps something had gone slightly wrong with that support specifically for Labour. They'll be watching very closely as to how these two constituencies go tonight.
Well, they'll look very closely at the results, but the problem is interpreting the results. What do they mean? Does the reduced turnout reflect contentment and apathy, or does it actually reflect deeper unease with traditional Labour supporters about the concentration of New Labour on Middle England?
OK, John Bartle for now. Thanks very much indeed.
Okay.
Time now for a look at the other main news stories tonight. Shots have been fired close to British Gurkhas who are in East Timor as part of the United Nations peacekeeping force. No one was hurt, but the peacekeepers have been facing difficulties establishing control. The Indonesian government has now lifted martial law in the province, effectively transferring power to the UN peacekeepers. The Australian general in charge of the operation has said he wants the remainder of his force to be deployed in East Timor as soon as possible. Meanwhile, in Indonesia's capital, Jakarta, 15,000 demonstrators have clashed with police outside the parliament building. They were protesting against a new government bill that gives more power to the military when a state of emergency is declared. Protesters began throwing rocks at police when their route to the parliament building was blocked. Victims of one of Britain's worst water poisoning cases at Camelford in North Cornwall suffered considerable damage to their brain function. A report in the British Medical Journal says studies carried out on people affected after aluminium sulfate entered the water supply showed their symptoms were caused by pollution, not anxiety as had been claimed. The British scientist who pioneered a new treatment which could delay or even reverse the menopause has said it's too early to say if it could have widespread use. The method devised by Professor Roger Gosling of Leeds University was used by American surgeons on a 30-year-old woman who'd gone through a premature menopause. The woman's own ovarian tissue, which had previously been removed, was replaced in an operation which appears to have restored her fertility.
There will be many, and there are many, speculations about how this technology could be used in other ways, and maybe will be eventually. But we've always felt, and I think that's true of the profession generally, that these techniques are needed and should be focused on emergency fertility conservation now. That doesn't just mean cancer patients, of course. It could mean other people who, for whatever reason, have to have their tissue stored.
A strike by junior doctors has been averted after a last-minute deal was agreed with the government. Under the new agreement, doctors will not work more than 56 hours a week and they will get better pay for working overtime. Doctors would have been balloted on industrial action if no solution was reached. Detectives in Suffolk are still questioning a man they arrested today in connection with the disappearance of missing teenager Vicky Hall. Vicky, who's 17, hasn't been seen since the early hours of Sunday morning. She was walking from a nightclub in Felixstowe to her home in nearby Trimley St Mary. The police say a 21-year-old man has been arrested on suspicion of abduction. The Ford Motor Company has apologised to a worker at its Dagenham plant after he suffered years of racial abuse. Sukhjit Pamar was threatened with physical assault and had graffiti scrawled on his pay packet. The Transport Workers Union said it was the worst case of racial discrimination it had ever come across. Ford said it was in discussions to reach a mutually agreeable settlement after Mr Pamar won his industrial tribunal. It's just before 11:15, a reminder of the headlines. Counting is underway at the by-elections in Hamilton South and Wigan. Labour are defending big majorities in both constituencies. Turnout is reported to be low. Tension has been high in East Timor as shots were fired near to British peacekeeping soldiers. And a new report says victims of one of Britain's worst water poisoning cases at Camelford in North Cornwall suffered considerable damage to their brain function. Now let's catch up on all the sports news.
Thank you. We start with golf, and the European pairings of the first day's matches of the 33rd Ryder Cup have been announced. The surprise inclusion is Irishman Padraig Harrington, who partners Miguel Angel Jimenez. But there's no place on the first day for Cup veteran Jose Maria Olazabal. The England scrum half Kieran Bracken and winger David Rees have been ruled out of the Rugby World Cup, which starts next month due to injury. And in tennis, the British #1 Greg Ruzetsky will kick off Great Britain's latest David Cup campaign against South Africa tomorrow. And that's all from the sports desk for now.
Thank you. Taiwanese and international rescue teams are still searching for survivors of the devastating earthquake which hit the country 3 days ago. More than 2,000 people are known to have been killed. Today, only a handful were pulled out alive. The authorities have arrested a building contractor as part of their investigation into why so many new buildings collapsed. James Robbins reports from Taichung, the city at the epicenter of the earthquake.
In temples across Taiwan, prayers for the dead resound day and night. It's a constant ritual in a land of Buddhists and Taoists. The living, the survivors and the bereaved are asking for peace for themselves. And they're asking for the protection of the souls of the dead lost to the earthquake. Flying over the mountain area of Taiwan, which has suffered most, it's all too clear why some rural districts are still cut off. We saw one dam wall which has been breached. Villages below it have been evacuated. Sluices opened to reduce the water pressure and the risk of total collapse. Below me and far from the capital Taipei, it's very easy to see the force of this enormous earthquake. Dozens of bridges are down. Helicopters are now the only way of bringing rescue teams and aid to those in most desperate need. In the town of Dongshe, in the shadow of the wreckage, tented villages are now well established. The rescue effort has been impressive, but there are still big questions about modern buildings which toppled when far less opulent older buildings did not. And on the ground, search teams have been celebrating some successes amid the heartache of unearthing bodies. Suddenly the whistles blow to stop and silence the search. A 60-year-old man has been found, emerging to the delight of rescuers. It really felt good, the team leader said, really good. He was not injured at all. But there's anger in Taiwan too. Evidence has been uncovered of shoddy, corrupt building work. Here, oil drums embedded in concrete were used in place of proper reinforcement, cutting corners in a country renowned for earthquakes. The police have arrested this building contractor. If convicted, he faces 7 years in jail. Prosecutors say more arrests are planned, and Taiwan's Prime Minister himself posed the question everyone is asking, why new buildings fell and older ones next door withstood the shaking. But here it seems the criminal negligence may be more limited than it was in Turkey, and the handling of the entire disaster by the authorities is far more decisive, with rescue efforts well planned and carried through. James Robbins, BBC News, Taichung in central Taiwan.
The Hollywood actor George C. Scott has died at the age of 71. During a long career, he starred in films including The Hustler and Dr. Strangelove. In 1970, he won an Oscar for playing the title role in the film Patton, but he turned down the award, describing the ceremony as a 2-hour meat parade. A shortage of space at London Fashion Week's main location has led to Britain's designers taking radical measures. Catwalks have been set up in shops, gardens and even old film studios. Models have increasingly been replaced by celebrities and even people off the street.
Scary Spice delivering a little oomph to Julian MacDonald's collection. Given that fashion shows are about press and hype, the show and the models are frequently more important than the clothes. And while there were no celebrities at Paul Smith's collection, his Indian fabrics matched with sharp tailoring were considerably more enchanting in amongst the foliage of Chelsea's Physic Garden.
The environment is very important, I think, even though it looks like it might rain, but It rains in India, so don't worry about it.
But all that's very West End. Here in the East End, London Fashion Week means something altogether different. A spontaneous street fashion show. Designers Kenichi Wakayama and Rie Watanabe have taken advantage of London Fashion Week and turned the street into a catwalk. Others have abandoned living models altogether. Zen contemplation here has replaced the noise and bright lights.
We wanted to create a silence and a Zen environment, and we try that every season to do it on a runway show, but all the erratic and wanting to get in and wanting to, it just takes away what I was trying to achieve.
But even in the West End, designers have a chance to show off without spending $20,000 on a catwalk show. Brown's has shown some in its window, and reassuringly, the clothes for supermodels pose problems for the mannequins.
The clothes that he made were actually made for somebody a size 8 or a size 6, very tiny, and because they were all boned, they didn't actually fit the mannequins.
But usually a model and catwalk is the only answer. Arcadius, star of the Fringe off-schedule show, showed how the impact of his clothes is somewhat enhanced when shown in the traditional style. And remember, this collection is his most wearable to date. David Silito, BBC News at London Fashion Week.
Gets stranger and stranger. That's all from me for the moment. Back to Matthew for the rest of the by-election news.
Joanna, thanks very much indeed. Well, both those by-election results are expected in the next 40 minutes or so. Probably first the Hamilton South result, and Wigan maybe inside the next 20 minutes. They're both counting very quickly at both centres. Well, with me watching all these figures coming in is Dr. John Bartle from Essex University. We hope to get the first result inside about the next 10 minutes. Just run through what the key figures that you'll be looking out for will be, because we're expecting Labour probably to hold both seats, but what figures will you be looking for most of all?
The most important figure is simply the number of people in every 100 who switched directly from Labour at the last general election to the SNP at this by-election. That will give us a measure of the degree of parties, changing party support over the period. But we're also interested in turnout. Turnout's gradually declined over the last 30 years or so, gradually. But in addition to that, recently we've seen very sharp falls in turnout, particularly in safe Labour seats. So in Leeds Central, we had a turnout of just 19.5%.
Isn't that simply voter fatigue, though? They've had so many elections in the last few months. We had the Scottish elections, we had the European elections, now this election. Isn't it simply voter fatigue? Perhaps in a couple of years that will pick up again.
Voter fatigue is less of an argument, of course, in England. The Scots have had elections in addition to referendums and elections to the Scottish Parliament. But we've actually seen reductions in turnout in by-elections in England, particularly in very, very safe Labour seats. So it is something that requires explanation. At the moment, explanations are elusive.
Well, you were talking about the figures of comparing it to the last general election. Let's just take a look at the figures from the 1997 Hamilton South election figure. There it is, a huge majority there for Labour, over 15,000. They won with 21,000, and there in second place, the SNP at 5,800. You can see from that graphic there just what a huge turnaround it would have to be for the SNP to turn that around.
Yes, if the Labour Party lost tonight, I wouldn't like to be a fly on the wall really in Millbank. There'd be some serious questions asked about the strategy and also about the timing of the by-election and the circumstances which brought it about.
Well, that has been a controversy in itself, but one remembers actually Winnie Ewing, who won this particular seat in '67, she did actually turn around a majority much the same size as that.
Yes, although it's a large hurdle, this sort of hurdle's been overcome in the past. Unfortunately, at the moment, the political circumstances wouldn't lead us to expect at all that sort of turnaround in the fortunes of the parties.
What about the constituency itself? Tell us a little about Hamilton South, the sort of constituency it is.
Well, it's very much a mixed constituency socially. It contains a lot of people who commute regularly to Glasgow It's also a legal and financial centre for that part of Lanarkshire. It's very much mixed. If it were in England, it would probably have been a Conservative Labour marginal for a long time. But because Scotland is different, it's been a pretty safe Labour seat, except for the 1967 by-election.
What should we read into the fact that they have a new Scottish Parliament there now? Is there likely to be what they describe as a Holyrood factor, where what we might see in this election is simply people voting on how the Scottish Parliament is doing, nothing to do with what is happening in Westminster and the rest of the country?
I think it's fascinating to actually watch the Scottish party system develop. Both voters and political parties are learning new ways of campaigning, new ways of thinking about this more complicated constitutional situation. So we may not see it immediately, but it will develop over the next 5-10 years.
Let's just take a quick look at what is going on in Hamilton at the moment. There's the count site, and as I said to you before, it's a pretty quick counting centre usually here. In the Scottish elections, Hamilton South was the first place that declared. In the 1997 general election, it was the second place in the country that declared. So it's got a long history of being able to get these results out pretty quickly. As I say, we're expecting that inside the next 15 or so minutes. Well, it's not the only place, of course, John, that we're having this by-election. We've got another in Wigan. Similar type of constituency, though.
Yes, rock solid Labour seat. Labour don't only dominate at parliamentary level, where they've had the MP since 1918, which is the year that the Labour Party constitution was drawn up. It's that long ago. But they're also dominant at a local level. The local council is completely dominated by the Labour Party. So you'd expect this again to be a very, very safe Labour seat.
Well, let's have a quick look at the 1997 figures of exactly what you're saying. There indeed is the graphic figures there. Look at that, 22,000 majority. So again, rather like Hamilton South, it would have to take a huge effort for the Conservatives to turn that around. And there you see the percentage share of the vote. This is really a battle, isn't it, between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats in terms of who can actually finish second.
Yes, it is. I would stress, don't be fooled so much by the numbers. We know turnout is considerably down, so don't become fixated by the size of the majority or the number of votes gained. We will work out eventually the percentage share of the vote, and that's the really important figure to look out for.
And just tell us a little about what the Tories and the Liberal Democrats will be looking for tonight in Wigan. These are actually live pictures coming from Hamilton South as the candidates. That's Dr. John Reid there with the candidate. So I think it's looking as if that we're going to get that result fairly soon, with some of the candidates actually coming out. Well, John Pienaar, our political correspondent, who's there at the count, who's watching these pictures and these scenes as we are here. John, how close are we to the actual announcement, the declaration of the result?
Well, Matthew, the counting stopped here at Hamilton Town Hall, and we look to be within a few minutes of the final declaration. Just a moment or two ago, we had the Labour candidate, Bill Tynan, coming to the hall. Big round of applause from his supporters. John Reid, the Scottish Secretary, standing next to him, grinning all over his face. They look as if they know the way it's going to go. And the way it's going to go, if all the predictions are right, is that the Labour majority that we saw, the thumping Labour majority at the last general election, will be cut back quite dramatically. And the SNP, as one would expect, comparatively putting up something of a good show. But no real doubt about the results, I think.
Yes, I don't want to preempt the result till we get the figures, but all eyes, we were hearing from our number cruncher here, all eyes on really how much that majority will be cut. How concerned will the Labour Party bosses be at that majority figure?
Well, it's always presentationally something of a problem when someone like the SNP, who are of course the main opposition party in Scotland, appear to be running them a close fight. But of course, against the background of a safe Labour seat, a good deal of voter apathy, largely because of the large number of elections that have been occurring in Scotland over the last 2.5 years. No one expected very much of a dramatic contest or really a dramatic result. So no one might be surprised at the way this thing turns out, but the lower reaches of the contest could provide some diversion. The Liberal Democrats look rather miserable. They're taking on, it looks like, the Scottish Socialists and even one of the fringe candidates for those lower places. And the Tories, of course, never expected to perform terribly well here, but they certainly won't have much to smile about.
What sort of campaign has it been like, John?
We saw a strong effort by the Labour Party bringing up the likes of John Prescott to get the vote out. They wanted to do what they could to combat that voter apathy. But of course that always looked like being an uphill task. John Reid I can see smiling very broadly. So they'll have the kind of outcome that they were hoping for if all the predictions are right. But of course it's been a low-key contest. There's been a good deal of voter apathy. It's so soon after the Scottish parliamentary elections that there's not an awful lot to be read into it, I think, from all those directions.
John, there was considerable controversy at the time of the calling of this by-election. Did that play big during the campaign?
Well, as you would expect, that decision to hold this contest in the course of the SNP conference in Inverness irritated the nationalists. It must have had something of an effect in diverting their resources and so on. But I guess when it comes right down to it, the contest seems to be going and to have gone the way the pundits and the pollsters had expected. That was one of the ripples of interest that we saw in the course of this fight.
Just one final question for you, John. How much has this election been to do with the Holyrood factor, the voters actually deciding on how well that is going, the Scottish Parliament, and casting their votes accordingly?
Well, I think you have to say there must have been something of a Holyrood factor from all sorts of different reasons. And so soon after its inception, the Holyrood Parliament hasn't had the best of presses. More headlines to do with MPs looking after their holidays and office allowances and so on than with the business of governing Scotland. But we are in early days and they'll have time ahead of them to build up their credibility. Some interesting, deeper political questions in the case of, say, the SNP. Now we have that Scottish Parliament. The question has been asked by clearly many voters. What's the point in voting for an SNP candidate for a Westminster seat when Westminster's been given that much of a lower priority by the SNP itself?
Yes, we're seeing the candidate there, Bill Tynan, with Dr. John Reid. If indeed they do win and win comfortably, a lot of rather uncomfortable questions for Alex Salmond. I mean, we've even heard some mutterings about his leadership. He's the oldest party leader up there.
It hasn't been an entirely comfortable time for Alex Salmond. He's at the moment up at his conference in Inverness. He's delivering his leadership speech in the course of tomorrow, and he'll be having to discuss what exactly went wrong during the course of the Holyrood campaign. Now, part of his answer will inevitably be that it wasn't quite as bad as everyone seems to think. They ended up as clearly the opposition force in Edinburgh with their 35 seats, but that was after a period of running Labour so strongly that Labour, it has to be said, were very nervous indeed. And then there are the tactics, the decision to go on the Penny for Scotland slogan, to promise to keep to use the tax-raising powers for the sake of schools and hospitals in Scotland, and it didn't help them win the contest. Now, we won't see Alex Salmond tomorrow, I'm sure, making any apology for that. I think it'll be a question of the party improving its game in time for the next fight that comes around, sticking by its principles, and that would include the question of taxation.
Well, John, we saw a brief shot just now here of the podium, which is still empty. They're still waiting for that result. Stay there, we'll be back to you in a short while when that result is announced. But here, watching those pictures with us, is John Bartle from Essex University. John there was talking about low turnout, also talking about Labour looking pretty confident. What do you think the minimum figure for the SNP will to avert all those questions that John was talking about directed at Alex Salmond?
I would have expected the SNP to have put on at least 15% extra from the 1997 general election, something in that order. There was a similar increase in support for the SNP in the Paisley South by-election in 1997. Labour support went down by 9%, so expect to swing about 12% if there's any you can actually predict from Paisley South to Hamilton South.
And that was the swing in the European elections, wasn't it? The SNP put about 15% on, so they wouldn't be looking to slip back further than that.
No, but then again, Alex Salmond is playing a long game now, and I think the SNP tactics will change very, very slowly as the Holyrood experiment goes on. So I don't think he will be judged too harshly on the basis of this particular by-election result.
John was hinting about strategy. One of the things they have to clearly decide, the SNP, is what the party actually stands for, whether it gets sucked into being an opposition party up in the new Scottish Parliament, or whether it is still solely looking for independence.
Well, of course, actually criticising the Labour government is a route into power. If Labour in power is perceived to have failed, then they'll look to an alternative. And at the moment, the Liberal Democrats nor the Conservatives look like an alternative government north of the border. So the strategies are actually linked.
Let's turn to the Wigan by-election, where we're also, as I say, expecting that result in the next 15, 20 minutes. There, indeed, is the hall where they're still counting. As I say, we're expecting that to be slightly quicker than originally expected in the next 15 or 20 minutes or so. Similar types of things happening there in Wigan as in Scotland.
Yes, turnout is very, very low. We don't have an immediate explanation for it, but one reason may be the decline of working class institutions, trade unions, the sort of people who were mobilised on the day of a by-election, knocked people up, persuaded and cajoled them to go to the polls. That may be part of the reason, but probably the overwhelming reason is just simply the practical politics. Labour has a majority of 179 seats in the House of Commons. Why bother to vote?
And this is an interesting constituency in terms of the candidates, because they're actually fielding here Labour what one would describe as perhaps old-style Labour candidates. The original Millbank choice, Jack Straw's advisor, didn't actually get through to be the candidate. It's somebody who perhaps may be seen as a bit of a traditionalist.
Well, I think a bit of a fast one was pulled on the party there, because actually, although he speaks like an old Labour candidate, he speaks with a very new Labour accent. And when he's interrogated, he is very, very close to the leadership line in policy terms.
We talked about the size of Hamilton South, which I think is 46,000. That's the size of the constituency there. Tell us a little more about the constituents here in Wigan.
Well, it's a much larger constituency, as all constituencies in England are larger than the Scottish constituencies. It's around 67,000 people in total. It's almost a third as much as you get in Hamilton South. The constituency itself is changed rapidly, of course, declining from the textiles industry. It's got a lot of new industries, such as the Heinz canning factory. It's changed rapidly. It's made a great deal of its heritage. And of course, the famous Wigan Pier attracts many tourists through the years.
And who, in terms of the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives, who is sitting best in terms of, is likely to emerge from this as the second place?
In theory, the Conservatives are in second place at the moment in Wigan. But given recent trends in opinion polls and by-election results, I expect the Lib Dems to pull through into second place.
OK, John Bartle for now. Thanks very much indeed. Well, as I said before, we're expecting both those results, surprisingly, to come almost in the same time in the next 10, 15 minutes or so. Hamilton South in Scotland and also in Wigan. Obviously, we're going to have more on this, but in the meantime, let's have a look at some of the day's other news.
Thanks, Matthew. Shots have been fired close to British Gurkhas who were in East Timor as part of the United Nations peacekeeping force. No one was hurt, but the peacekeepers have been facing difficulties establishing control. The Indonesian government has now lifted martial law in the province, effectively transferring power to the UN peacekeepers. The Australian general in charge of the operation wants the remainder of his force to arrive in East Timor as soon as possible. Meanwhile, 15,000 demonstrators have clashed with police outside the Indonesian parliament in Jakarta. They were protesting against a new government bill that gives more power to the military in a state of emergency. Protesters began throwing rocks at police when their route to the parliament building was blocked. Victims of one of Britain's worst water poisoning cases at Camelford in North Cornwall suffered considerable damage to their brain function. A report in the British Medical Journal says studies carried out on people affected after aluminium sulfate entered the water supply showed their symptoms were caused by pollution, not by anxiety, as had been claimed. A strike by junior doctors had been averted after a last-minute deal was agreed with the government. Doctors would have been balloted on industrial action if no solution had been reached. Under the new agreement, doctors will not work more than 56 hours a week and they'll get better pay for working overtime. The British scientist who pioneered a new treatment which could delay or even reverse the menopause has said it's too early to say whether it could have widespread use. The method, devised by Professor Roger Gosling of Leeds University, was used by American surgeons on a 30-year-old woman who'd gone through a premature menopause. The woman's own ovarian tissue, which had previously been removed, was replaced in an operation which appears to have restored her fertility. The Ford Motor Company has apologised to a worker at its Dagenham plant after he suffered years of racial abuse. Sukhjit Pamar was threatened with physical assault and had graffiti scrawled on his pay packet. The Transport Workers Union said it was the worst case of racial discrimination it had ever come across. Ford said it was in discussions to reach a mutually agreeable settlement after Mr Pamar won his industrial tribunal. Detectives in Suffolk have been questioning a man they arrested in connection with the disappearance of missing teenager Vicky Hall. Vicky, who is 17, hasn't been seen since the early hours of Sunday morning. She was walking from a nightclub in Felixstowe to her home in nearby Trimley St Mary. Police say a 21-year-old man was arrested on suspicion of abduction. Teachers in England and Wales are to have their pay linked to how well their pupils perform. The Education Secretary, David Blunkett, said the move was aimed at raising standards in the classroom. He said there would be extra rewards linked to improvements in individual pupils, whatever their ability. But some teachers are opposing the proposals. The NASUWT union says they're unfair and divisive because some staff have brighter pupils than others. The Hollywood actor George C. Scott has died at the age of 71. During a long career, he starred in films, including The Hustler and Dr. Strangelove. In 1970, he won an Oscar for playing the title role in the film Patton, but he turned down the award, describing the ceremony as a 2-hour meat parade. That's all the news from me for the moment. Back to Matthew for the by-election news.
Joanna, thanks very much indeed. Well, let's go straight to Hamilton South because we're pretty close to actually getting the result there. There you see live pictures. We're expecting that result inside the next 5 or 10 minutes. It's, of course, been a Labour seat since 1970. George Robertson, the former Defence Secretary, held it from 1978. He, of course, has been elevated to the Lords as he goes off to become the new Secretary-General of NATO. And it is a smallish constituency, 46,000, and we're expecting that result, I would say, in the next 5 or 10 minutes. The SNP, the big challenger up there, they are looking to turn that around. They'd need a 24% swing to actually win that seat. Well, of course, there's another by-election going on in Wigan, and from there, our political correspondent, Laura Trevelyan, joins us now.
Good evening, Matthew. Well, we have actually just got the turnout here in Wigan. It's 25%, and we're expecting the result probably within 15 to 20 minutes. And joining me now is Phil Willis, who's Labour's campaign manager here. Phil, good evening. A little bit disappointed by a 25% turnout. Weren't you hoping for at least 30?
We would have liked more, obviously. It's bigger than the last by-election in Leeds. We're pleased with that. It's nearly twice what it was in this constituency in the European elections. So we don't think that it's too disappointing. Obviously, all politicians would like to see it higher, but it's about what we expected. And it did rain a lot this evening. I'm still a bit damp from the rain this evening.
But there's quite a worrying trend, though, isn't there, that we're seeing in elections in this country of a low turnout. I mean, that must worry you as someone who is hoping the voters will go out and put him back in next time.
It does, you know, not particularly in this by-election, but generally we would, all of us, like to see the turnout up. But I think it does reflect an election like this, where, of course, a new Member of Parliament has been elected, but it's not going to change the government, it's not going to have a big policy impact, and therefore people who traditionally vote in the general election don't bother to turn out. But we would like to see it increased, obviously.
And of course there was the tragic death here of the very popular local MP. Do you think maybe that had something to do with the low turnout, people perhaps grieving and not wanting to go out?
I don't think so. I mean, there's no doubt that Roger Stott was extremely well known. He'd been the MP here for over 25 years. He was extremely well known, and obviously he had a strong personal vote. But having said that, our candidate, Neil Turner, has been a councillor here for 25 years, and he's very well known, particularly in his ward. So I don't think that's had an effect. I'm quite pleased privately with the turnout. I would have been very worried if it had been below 20. I would have liked to have seen 30. I'm not surprised, but we would like more.
Thank you very much, Phil. Thanks very much indeed. And now, handing back now to the studio.
Laura, thanks very much indeed. Sorry to cut her off there quite abruptly, but we're doing that because in Hamilton South we're expecting a result fairly shortly, but I gather as I say that they're moving away from the rostrum. So in the meantime, let's get a few more views from John Bartle from Essex University, who's watching all these developments as they unfold. Well, we thought we were going to have the result, but we're going to have to wait just a little longer. Laura was just talking there to the Liberal Democrats, and they were concerned, as all parties should be, about turnout.
Yes, it's been a problem for a long time. In fact, there are two trends. One, a long-term trend of declining turnout, which is quite mysterious because we have an ageing population. Older people tend to vote more than younger people. We also have a more educated population, and of course there have been increasing levels of education for the last 30 years, but turnout has tended to decline very, very gradually. More recent phenomenon is a major and almost seismic decline in turnout in by-elections, and this is particularly true in very, very, very safe Labour seats. For example, in the 1992-97 Parliament, in Barnsley East and Mexborough, which is traditionally one of the safest Labour seats in the country, you have turnouts down to around 33%. So this has developed over the last 5 years or so. As I say, it's unclear why this should be the case. One reason could simply be that Labour is on a high. Labour was on a high in 1996, the Barnsley by-election. Why go out and vote? It's not going to change anything. Conservatives, of course, they're on a loser, so they don't vote either. Alternatively, this trend seems to be accentuated in the 1997-1999 period, where the decline has gone down even further. Leeds Central, 19.5%. That's its lowest level since 1958 at a by-election in Finsbury.
OK, John Bartle, let's leave it there. Let's go back to Scotland and Hamilton South, where there was that flurry of excitement just a few seconds ago. Our political correspondent John Pienaar is there. John, what was behind that little burst of activity up there?
Well, as you saw, the announcement from the stage of a recount took everyone by surprise. There was a gasp around the hall. It seems that the SNP are the party which asked for this recount, which seems to suggest, we're getting the details now and we'll confirm it a little later on, but it seems to suggest they may be closer to Labour than we might have thought, and they're looking to maximise their advantage at this stage. So perhaps more of an exciting result than we might have anticipated.
Well, that would be quite a turnout, wouldn't it, given what we were discussing a short while ago. Just for viewers who may not be particularly expert at this, can a party just simply call for a recount for any reason?
Oh yes, it can, and they do it for many reasons. It doesn't necessarily mean that their position in relation to the other parties at stake. It may just mean that they want to get the maximum possible juice out of the voting, as it's turned out. And if the SNP look as if they can claim a reasonable chase on Labour, it might well be worth their while getting a recount to see if they can get their figures up. At the moment, I have to say, it looks as if Labour still seem to be grinning broadly, but let's wait and see. The SNP wouldn't have called for a recount for no reason. It could be an interesting night.
One remembers back in 1967 when Winnie Ewing astonished Labour by pulling off a similar size of turning around a majority of the 15,000 or so. But we're not really expecting that tonight, are we?
Well, I think we would all be fairly astonished if anything of that kind happened. But by-elections are by-elections, of course, and we always expected, and we know how the SNP can put out their people when the time comes. Give Labour a reasonably good fight on the doorsteps in the context of a by-election. But of course, Labour, it has to be said, confident throughout of the result. They don't look as if they're panicking to me just now.
Let's talk about the pressure that the SNP have been under during this by-election. It is a relatively crucial one for them in terms of the strategy that lies ahead for them, isn't it?
Well, against the context, as you say, of the recent Scottish parliamentary elections, at a time when Alex Salmond tomorrow is going to be addressing the troops and discussing strategy, yes, this is interesting. Now, let's look at some of the questions that have to be addressed in the course of that post-mortem. The SNP, at the time of the Scottish parliamentary elections, went for that high-risk strategy of higher taxes than Labour. Now, it didn't do them an awful lot of good at the ballot box on that occasion, and Alex Salmond will have to give some explanation of why that was no blunder, why the principle behind that decision was the principle he wants to stick with. Of course, there were other questions as well at that time. Alex Salmond came out strongly against the bombing of Kosovo. That was a high gamble. Perhaps some discussion of that. We'll have to wait and see when Alex Salmond speaks, but he's going to be pretty bullish about the way things were done.
John Pienaar there in Hamilton South. There's obviously a delay there as they go through this recount. So for the while, thanks very much indeed. Well, Dr. John Bartle is still here in the studio. Interesting that there is a recount, but we shouldn't read too much into it.
No, when I first saw on another screen over there that they were recounting, I assumed that the Conservatives were asking for a recount to save their deposit. It would be absolutely amazing if the SNP won this seat. Clearly they must think they're very, very close. I don't know why they're unhappy with the count. They may be engaging in some form of brinkmanship, just trying to make it more dramatic. There was a recount at Hamilton South. Or they may just feel that they're very, very close to winning, and why not try? Why not have a recount?
Well, I gather we're only about 5 minutes or so away from actually getting a result in Wigan. Hamilton South may have gone back, but Wigan seems to be progressing rather quicker than expected. I think those are pictures from Wigan. We'll leave those, given that they're slightly obscured. There indeed we see Labour's candidate there, as he looks pretty confident as well. So it looks as if we can read anything into these pictures, a good night for Labour at both constituencies. They look fairly relaxed and confident there.
Mm. It looks to me as if Labour is safely home in Wigan. Though, of course, Mr Tynan looked equally happy when he came to the hall in Hamilton South.
Well, as I say, there is the count there in Wigan. We're expecting that result inside the next 3 or 4 minutes. Let's just bring you a little background to Wigan, because it's been an interesting constituency. It's been a fairly hard fight. They've got a huge majority there in Wigan. Let's just bring you a bit of the background to the case. It was, of course, caused by the death of the sitting Labour MP, Roger Stott, and Labour's held that since 1918. We were hearing John Bartle talking about the seismic shift that would be needed. There it is, since 1918, a Labour seat, and even in the local elections, all but one of the seats held by Labour there. And in the European elections, which wasn't a good night for Labour, they beat the Conservatives by 2-1. So, I mean, there's the evidence, John. A rock-solid Labour seat, one would expect.
Ultra-compact, full of history, a tradition of voting Labour, a sense that to be living in Wigan is to identify oneself with the Labour Party. Yes, it would take an amazing shift of public opinion.
Coal, cotton and canals was how I heard it described. I mean, very much the traditional industries some years ago, but it has moved, but not from its traditional Labour base.
No, which is an interesting phenomenon. In many parts of the South, for example, during the 1980s under Mrs Thatcher, a lot of the new towns where there were a lot of new industries moved steadily away from the Labour Party. Places like Peterborough, Stevenage, Welling Garden City and so on moved steadily away from the Labour Party. Not Wigan, as it's enjoyed economic prosperity, it stayed with Labour. And so perhaps we can call this Labour's heartland. If anything happened here in terms of a serious loss of support for Labour, they'd be very worried indeed.
But we can expect a fall perhaps in the size of that majority given the turnout figures.
Yes, the turnout figures are very, very low, 25%. So even if there were no swing to Labour, we'd be expecting a majority down to around 16,000, even if there were no swing.
The Liberal Democrats, we heard briefly from them a little earlier, but what are they looking at here?
The Liberal Democrats would like to build on success from Leeds Central when they had an amazing swing of 20% in a very, very similar seat, which had been Labour for years on end, and they made some great progress in the inner city areas, offering themselves as a tax and spend alternative to New Labour.
Let's just have a quick look through the candidates that are standing in Wigan, because it's relatively interesting. Neil Turner there, an interesting choice, perhaps not Millbank's choice of candidate, very much an old-style Labour figure who I think said if he was going to win here, he'd be lobbying ministers with the traditional views coming from his supporters.
Yes, as I said, very much old Labour in his constituency, very political, but speaks old Labour with a new Labour accent, has adopted his language, changed it very subtly, a professional politician in many ways. I think he'll be more New Labour than he sounds at the moment.
Well, as I say, we're only a couple of minutes away from that actual result coming there from Wigan. Let's rejoin our correspondent there, Laura Trevelyan, who's waiting with us for a result. What do we think, Laura? A couple of minutes?
Yeah, Matthew, it's really not very far away at all. And I've got a guest with me now. In fact, yes, you can hear it's happening very soon. That's the returning officer calling all the candidates to come up and have a chat with him. And this is when they talk about the results. He says, this is what I think the result is. And if anyone's trying to dispute it, that's what happens there. But I have a guest with me now. I have Stephen O'Brien, who is the most recent Conservative by-election victor. Now, Stephen, tell me, you're not going to win this seat, but are you hoping for a close second?
Oh, I think that we fought an excellent and very vigorous campaign, very positive campaign, and I'm confident that the electors of Wigan will endorse us with a second place and show that they want an alternative to New Labour.
But a very disappointing turnout, 25%. I mean, surely that's not good.
Well, that must be of a real concern to Mr Blair and New Labour, that his people are not turning out. Wigan has been a Labour stronghold over many years, and they're not turning out to support and endorse his government. And I would be quite surprised if Labour were able to get more than half the majority that they had secured at the general election.
Now, you mounted a very vigorous campaign here. You had William Hague here, you had Michael Portillo here, but you've ignored Wigan for years. I mean, it's quite insulting, isn't it, to turn out now after having ignored these people for so long?
Well, on the contrary, it shows that the Conservatives have no no-go areas. We know that on the doorsteps, as we vigorously have campaigned around in Wigan, that we've found that they are delighted to see us, they're glad that we're here in Wigan, offering what the Conservatives are saying, and that they really do want to see that there is a campaign to save the pound, not to scrap the pound, as they believe that New Labour is trying to do, and that they really do want to see taxes not put up, but kept under control and ultimately to be taken down.
Stephen O'Brien, thanks very much indeed. Well, as we are literally just a few minutes away from the result, Matthew, I'll hand back to you and we'll be talking to you very soon.
Laura, thanks very much indeed. Let's rejoin John Bartle here and pick up where we left off. What particularly will you be looking for in that Wigan result when you hear those figures?
Well, as I say, I would have been surprised to hear the Conservatives come second place in this constituency. They don't seem to have made a great deal of progress in terms of improving their image amongst the public in the last 12 months or so. And I would have expected the Liberal Democrats to put in a quite strong performance. So I'll be interested to see who comes second place in that constituency.
This is the 7th and 8th by-election since the general election, the two we've got tonight. Is there any danger of extrapolating the results that we see tonight into a national picture?
Well, it would be impossible to extrapolate the by-election results from the start of this Parliament into any sort of picture. We've had a very odd mixed set of results, starting, of course, Uxbridge several weeks after the election, when there was a swing back to the Conservatives of 5%, largely because in the specific circumstances of Uxbridge, the Labour Party had parachuted in a Millbank appointee, and that caused some disappointment in the constituency. Paisley South was a one-off by-election caused by unusual circumstances of an MP suicide. There have been swings to all the parties over the period, and you couldn't possibly extrapolate any sort of prediction for the future from by-elections. In fact, historically, by-elections have been extraordinarily poor predictors, not just of the national election result, but also of the result in the individual constituency. Of course, under Mrs Thatcher, many of the seats that fell to the Liberal Democrats in the period 83 to 87 reverted to the Conservatives in 1987. They held them for a few months, a few years, but as soon as a real general election came along, turnout increased and they lost the seats.
John, we'll leave it there for a moment. Thanks very much indeed. Well, we're expecting those results in the next few minutes. We've kept saying that over the last 15 or so, but we're expecting Wigan very shortly. Let's just squeeze in a bit of weather in the meantime with Carol Kirkwood.
Thank you, Matthew. Well, we've had quite a wild time in the weather front today. We had a few tornadoes much earlier on in High Wycombe, Ruislip and Pagham, and they did do some damage, especially the one in Pagham in West Sussex. Now, we've had a fair few showers, heavy in places, rattling across the British Isles, then followed again by another band. And if we zoom in case you live in this area in the southwest, from the brighter colours you can see where the heaviest bands are, pushing into southern parts of Wales. We've already gone through Pembroke, and then into Scotland as well. You can see around Crean Loury some hefty showers, and also just in the northeast of England around Newcastle. So if you are heading out on the roads, do take extra care. Now, the showers will continue, and then as we go through tomorrow, you can see how they become more widespread before dying back as we lose the heat of the day. And tomorrow again we'll see more mist and fog patches forming overnight, as we will tonight. So not a particularly cold night ahead. We're looking at lows of 9 degrees Celsius around central parts of Scotland, and as we sweep down to the south, we're looking at overnight lows between 13 and 15 degrees Celsius. So tomorrow morning the showers continue in many southern and western parts of the British Isles, some of them heavy as well and thundery. Through many central and eastern parts of Scotland, though, when we lose the mist and fog patches, it will be dry and relatively bright, as indeed it will down eastern parts of the British Isles. But through the afternoon the showers again becoming more widespread, some of them heavy and thundery and squally, and don't be surprised if you see the odd hailstone in there as well through the course of the afternoon. Temperatures tomorrow ranging from 14 degrees Celsius in the Northern Isles to about 17 in Belfast to a a warm 21 degrees Celsius in the southeast at 70 Fahrenheit. So by the time we get to Saturday, dry and bright again for many eastern areas, but again with the showers in the west, they're going to continue their journey, moving over towards some eastern parts through the course of the afternoon, and again some of them could be heavy and thundery, and temperatures on Saturday ranging from about 15 to 20. But by the time we get to Sunday, it's looking much brighter for many of us after we lose mist or fog, but still the chance of showers in central parts of England and the southeast. Matthew.
Carol, thanks very much indeed. You're watching a by-election special here on BBC News 24. We're expecting the results both from Hamilton South and in Wigan anytime in the next 15 or so minutes. There's a recount going on in Hamilton South. In Wigan, though, the candidates have been told to expect the result in the next few minutes. I think we have live pictures from Wigan that we can show you. There indeed is the podium. The candidates were called to the returning officer about 3 or 4 minutes ago and told to expect that result in the next couple of minutes. That's the point in Scotland where the SNP asked for the recount. No such delay here in Wigan. We've been hearing from Laura Trevelyan, our political correspondent, a little earlier, a very low turnout in Wigan. The same story also in Scotland. But both constituencies have a big Labour majority, and Labour is expecting to hold these 2 seats with no problem at all. But we shall see. We're not too far away from hearing the results. And watching these pictures is John Bartle, our expert from Essex University. As I said, Labour hold both seats, big majorities, but does that low turnout potentially mean that the majorities might be cut quite dramatically?
It does. I mean, we've seen some very large figures, 23,000 in Wigan. This is going to be much, much, much lower, possibly in the region of 7,000, 5,000. It's difficult to know at the moment. And similarly, in Hamilton South, of course, we've got a recount, which is jolly exciting. And who said by-elections are no fun anymore?
What do you read into that?
I thought I saw the Labour faces still smiling broadly. So the SNP may be engaging in a little last-minute brinkmanship, improving morale. There was a recount in Hamilton South.
I'll interrupt you there because we're going to go straight up to Hamilton South and our political correspondent there, John Pienaar. He's at the count in Hamilton Town Hall. John, what is the latest up there?
Just a few minutes now, maybe 4 or 5 minutes from the result, Matthew, and the suspicions, I think, pretty much borne out. Yes, Labour are grinning, but these are grins, it seems, pretty much as much of relief as anything else. The SNP, it does seem, have run them pretty close. That's the reason for the recount, and I think also, as you were saying in the studio, a strong effort by the SNP to get the maximum possible juice, the maximum possible drama out of that.
John, I'm going to stop you there because I think we're about to have a result from Wigan. We're juggling with 2 by-elections. There you see all the candidates. There you see the returning officer coming to the microphone. So with no further delay, let's go over and hear what he has to say.
For the Wigan constituency, the date of the poll was the 23rd of September 1999. I, the undersigned, being the acting returning officer for the constituency of Wigan, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the said election was as follows. David Oswald Braid,
he's a Reverend.
58. Paul Davis,
Natural Law Party.
64. Stephen Ebbs,
National Democratic Resistance.
100. William Kelly,
Socialist Labour Party.
240. Christopher James Mayle,
No Registered Party.
190. Thomas Peat,
Conservative.
2,912. Jonathan Daniel Rule,
Liberal Democrat.
2,148. Neil Turner, 9,600.
The victorious Labour Party candidate.
I will read that again. 9,641. John Whittaker, 834.
UK Independence Party.
And I do hereby declare that the said Neil Turner has been duly elected to serve as a member for this constituency. Thank you very much.
Welcome to viewers from BBC One. You join a BBC News 24 special, extended coverage of two by-elections tonight from Wigan and Hamilton South. You're just seeing live pictures of the result from Wigan, where the Labour candidate Neil Turner has just been returned as the new MP. Let's hear what he has to say.
And he's going to be a very, very hard task for me to follow in his footsteps, serving the people of Wigan in Parliament. Mr. Returning Officer, can I thank you and all your staff and all the other agencies who've carried out this election so wonderfully smoothly. My agent tells me, and he's quite an expert at by-elections these days, that this is one of the smoothest campaigns he's ever run. It was like somebody gliding across the ice, smooth all the way through. And I would like you to take that back to your staff and just say that. How are you quite going to do that and persuade the staff that Brian Hayes is something like Trevelyan and Dean is something that's going to be quite difficult for you to do, but I'm sure it's a task that you will rise to. Can I also thank my agent and particularly my campaign manager Ian McCartney, and I'm sure equally we would want to pass on our good wishes and our thoughts to Ian at this particular time. This campaign has been a good campaign. Nobody has done the dirty. We've all fought it. We've all had our differences, but we all believe that the ballot box is the right way forward in a democracy to make sure that the will of the people is carried out. And that has been carried out tonight. It's a tremendous result for Wigan. It's a tremendous result for the Labour Party. We need to remember that we are 2 years into a Labour government, and the last time we were in this position, in 1974 to 79, we were losing seats to the Conservatives with 23% swings. Tonight, we have held this seat with a tremendous majority, a tremendous share of the vote. That is a good result for the Labour Party, and I thank each and every one of the members of the Wigan constituency Labour Party and all of those members from the Labour Party from the North West and throughout the country who have come along and helped me gain this result tonight. But it's also a good result for Wigan. I've had a very proud to be serving as Wigan councillor for 25 years. I now have to go on another stage and serve Wigan people in Parliament. I look forward to that. It will be a challenge. It will be something that will not be an easy task for me to do, but I know that with your support, the support of the Labour Party, the support of Wigan people, that can be successful and Wigan can go forward. We've got a proud record, we're a proud town, we are proud people. I look forward to serving you in Parliament for this next 2 years till the general election and beyond that, serving with Tony Blair, making sure that Wigan is part of a new Labour government, a new Britain, serving the people, making sure that all of our people are better at the end of that time. Thank you very much.
Well, that was Neil Turner, the successful Labour candidate, talking there to all his supporters that had packed that hall in Wigan. Welcome to all our viewers. You're watching a BBC News 24 by-election special with that Wigan result that we've just had. We're also expecting in the next 15 or so minutes the result from the Hamilton South by-election in Scotland. Well, watching that result from Wigan is our political correspondent, Laura Trevelyan. Laura, that result there, a majority cut from 23,000 to 7,000.
Yes, exactly. Not a very good result for Labour. But I think the most disappointing thing for them about this by-election really is the turnout, just 25%. I mean, that really is very low. It's one of the lowest since the Second World War, in fact. Quite an extraordinarily low turnout, and one that really they will be very disappointed about despite all the fact that they have actually managed to hold on to the seat.
I suppose no real surprise at the outcome. It would have been a seismic shift for Labour to actually lose this seat. The low turnout, that must worry all the political parties, not just Labour. Well, I think Laura Trevelyan there having some difficulty with her earpiece there. Let me just tell you the figures there of that Labour victory there in Wigan. Neil Turner scored, polled 9,651 votes. Tom Peat from the Conservatives had 2,912 votes, and the Liberal Democrat had 2,148 votes. As I said to you before, the majority before at the last election was 23,000, so a big cut in that majority for Labour. Well, watching those results here with me is John Bartle from Essex University. Well, you've been number crunching with me in the last hour or so. That is a big drop, isn't it?
It is a big drop, but given that turnout was 25% and it had previously been around 70%, if you multiply it up, it's actually it's approaching around 19,000, something like that, if the turnout had risen to the figures for the general election. So I think Labour will be actually fairly happy. They've retained 59% of the support of electors of Wigan. There's some moderate comfort there for Mr Hague. If you work out the swing to the Conservatives, it's 5%, but that swing is largely made up of the drop in Labour support rather than any increase in Conservative support, which is just nudged up by about 1.5%. The Liberal Democrats made some improvement by about 3%, but I think they'll be very disappointed with that result as well.
We'll come to the other parties in just a moment, but let's start with Labour and how they might view it, because after the European elections there was a lot of concern about Labour's heartland vote. Well, you couldn't get a more rock-solid Labour seat than this one in Wigan, and yet the majority has fallen. It seems to underline the problem they had back in June.
Well, it may be a problem, it may not be a problem. The problem here is one of interpretation. Now, does Labour supporters staying at home and not going out on a by-election on a wet day in Wigan indicate discontent with the way that Labour is developing, its appeal to Middle England, and its apparent rejection of many old Labour values and the old language of Labour? Or does it actually represent contentedness? The knowledge that no matter what happened, whether you missed Coronation Street tonight or missed EastEnders, you would actually still have a Labour government with a whacking big majority, safe and secure in Westminster. It's a matter of interpretation. I'm sure Philip Gould would like to take some of his focus groups and try and find out a little more about why natural core Labour supporters are reluctant to go out and support Labour.
OK, for now, John Bartle, thanks very much. Well, we've re-established that line to Laura Trevelyan, our political correspondent there in Wigan. Laura, we were just hearing about the analysis of the Labour vote. Let's start with that. First of all, this is a Labour heartland. How disappointed will they be to see their majority cut the way it was?
Well, it's interesting because what they're saying is that, of course, a by-election quite close to here in July in Edinburgh, the Labour turnout was very high because it was a very hotly contested election, which the Conservatives won, but Labour came a very close second. The turnout was 52%. Now here, which is an absolute Labour heartland, what Labour strategists are saying is that people feel quite contented with the government. They don't feel there's any reason to turn out. They don't feel scared of the threat of a possible Conservative victory.
Laura, I'm going to have to interrupt you there because we're juggling with two by-elections. Hamilton South is about to declare. Let's go straight over and hear the result from Hamilton South.
£1,406 then for Charles Ferguson, the Tory. £634 for the Liberal Democrats. And 61 for the UK Independence Party. $1,035 for the fringe candidate from the Hamilton Academicals and ahead of the Lib Dems. 113 the Scottish Unionist Party. something just over 7,000. Couldn't catch the figure for Bill Tynan, but clearly very, very close to the SNP. So Bill Tynan, the elected Labour candidate, coming to the rostrum for his victory speech. Loud cheers, of course, from the Labour camp.
Well, we're having a few sound problems there from Hamilton South. Watching that declaration is our political correspondent, John Pienaar. John, Labour hold, but with a very substantial cut in their majority.
Yes, that was the reason for the SNP recount. It was worth their while to get that recount to milk the maximum possible drama from this result. Of course, the outcome very much as expected, but many factors came into play here. A good deal of voter apathy. The Labour vote perhaps not quite as strong as anyone might have expected, even in pessimistic forecasts, and so it turned out to be a pretty tight fight.
And just very quickly with the maths, what was their majority?
Well, a slight problem here was with the sound here too, and couldn't quite get the final figures. They're being rushed out to me now, so let's have a look at what we have here. The Labour candidate returned with 7,172 votes. Now the SNP, his closest challenger, Annabel Ewing, came in at 6,616. So within just a few hundred votes of the SNP overhauling them. The outcome as expected, but very much a close fight there. And as for lower down the order, we saw the Lib Dems overhauled by one of the fringe candidates in this election, the man from the Hamilton Academicals.
So some very interesting figures there, John. We were talking earlier about strategy from the SNP. They will feel vindicated with the campaign they've run.
Well, it'll be a much rosier picture for Alex Salmond to present to his party when he addresses the SNP conference in Inverness tomorrow. Had it been a wider margin of defeat, then he could have had some awkward questions to answer. There would have been tactical questions about the future of the SNP in relation to Westminster by-elections, having established itself so very clearly at Holyrood. Now, that pressure has very much been eased by the closeness of this result, and we'll be looking at other factors on the Labour side of the equation. Simply beyond the question of apathy in voters as a whole, the question of do Labour voters, the core Labour voters, turn up when they're required to. All these things come into play. It's obviously not quite a straightforward, simple calculation, but the SNP have some reason to be rather pleased.
John Pienaar, stay there. We're just going to dip in to hear Bill Tynan as he speaks there to his supporters, holding that seat, but with a tiny majority. Let's hear what he's saying.
George Robertson, who I wish well in his new role. To my wife Betty, my daughters and my friends. And once more, I thank the people of Hamilton South. Thank you.
Bill Tynan there, the victor of the third Hamilton South by-election since the war. Let's have a look at the share of the vote. And Labour has 37%. The Scottish National Party, 34%.
Well, we're just seeing the SNP candidate actually come to the microphone. Bill Tynan was the victorious candidate. Let's hear the SNP candidate who narrowly missed overturning that Labour seat. Well, that sound line has again gone down. So let's bring in our number cruncher, John Bartle from Essex University. The SNP asked for a recount, and that was extraordinarily close, wasn't it?
Yeah, by-elections are fun once again. They're not dull like the first 7 this year have been. The swing was 23%, just short of the 24% they required. And of course, perhaps Tony Blair, Gordon Brown will be thinking long and hard about what they've actually set up for themselves. With the Scottish Parliament, there may be a new dynamic in operation in the Scottish Parliament and in Scottish politics generally. The SNP, I'm sure, will be delighted that they came very close. Of course, they'll be disappointed that they failed to win the seat. But this will give them hope that any more by-elections, particularly ones that were needlessly created with the elevation of George Robertson to General Secretary of NATO, it will stop and make Labour think very hard about creating these by-elections in future.
There were so many questions that the SNP were facing over the last couple of days and weeks, from the tactics used by Alex Salmon to even the candidate Annabel Ewing, who made it quite clear her preference was to actually sit in the Scottish Parliament rather than Westminster. But they've come incredibly close to actually overturning what was supposed to be a rock-solid Labour seat.
In by-elections, of course, the large national issues that are debated in the media and that concern us as political scientists and journalists often fly over the heads of the average person living in Hamilton South or places like that.
Well, one Labour MP said if this by-election was simply about local issues, they would win no problem. Their concern was it being turned into a Scotland, a wider picture by-election. Is that what happened?
It could be, but I suspect what's happened here is the SNP have simply mobilised very effectively their vote. They're extremely good at organising for by-elections like this. They can take in many party workers, persuade people that they've got a chance, that it's perhaps Hamilton South's chance to send a message of discontent to Westminster and to Tony Blair. And they just simply may have organised on the ground. In by-elections, organisation is a great deal of the campaign.
But it's interesting what they're disenchanted with, because Tony Blair, Donald Dewar were saying things couldn't be much better, and if you look at the constituency, they're doing fairly well in the constituency. Why are Labour voters in Scotland, in this particular Hamilton South constituency, so disenchanted?
Well, they may not be disenchanted. As I say, we have an interpretation problem. They may actually be quite content and just rationally staying at home. It would be irrational in these circumstances to weigh shoe leather cost and go and vote, especially on an evening like this, a dark evening in Scotland. Labour will presumably try and establish some form of inquiry. This sort of loss of support or failure to mobilise support in their heartlands will start asking them questions. The Conservatives didn't just lose in 1997 because of swings in Middle England. They lost because they lost a lot of their support in their heartlands. They took these areas for granted, and in 1997, after a long period of neglect, they reached vengeance on the Conservative Party. Perhaps Tony Blair will start thinking we need to investigate these sorts of issues.
OK, let's pause there. Let's go back to Wigan, because our political correspondent there has the winning candidate, Neil Turner. So let's go straight over and hear what he has to say.
Good morning, Matthew. Well, I'm here with Neil Turner, with the winning candidate, as you were saying, and he's with me now. Congratulations, Mr. Turner.
Thank you very much.
But it was a very low turnout, and your share of the vote was very much reduced. Aren't you a little disappointed?
Well, I think the share of the vote is disappointing, but you have to recollect that this is 2 years into a government which is very, very popular. This is a very strong seat. We had difficulty persuading our voters that it was really worth their while turning out. And one of the difficulties we had was at the last 2 hours of the day, we had this tremendous downpour, which just put immediately after people are having the tea. Traditionally, that's when Wigan people go out and vote quite heavily, and obviously they were decided to stay at home, thinking that it was a safe seat. And as for the actual reduction, I'm not quite sure that it is all that bad when you consider that the number of additional candidates that we've had. Obviously they were going to take votes from somebody, they've taken them from across the board. So no, I'm not disappointed at all. I think it's a tremendous result for Labour, and I think it's a tremendous result for Wigan.
But you say you were having difficulty persuading people it was worth going out voting Labour, but you're spending all this money on health, on education. Why was it difficult to motivate them to go out?
Well, simply because if you've got 22,000 majority and it's tippling down with rain, then you can find better things to do than go out. What we did find that was earlier on in the day, people were turning out very, very well. When the sun was shining, it was good. We were getting a good turnout at that time. It was only in the evenings that it tailed off quite dramatically.
You don't detect any disillusionment with New Labour?
Well, I don't think so. The result shows otherwise, does it not?
But it's true, is it not, that you were selected by the local association over someone who was very much a Millbank favourite, Jack Straw's special advisor Ed Owen. Doesn't that show that Labour people here in Wigan want to have someone who's going to be quite independent and not just a Labour Party stooge?
There were six candidates who were chosen to be put on the shortlist, and I won on the first ballot. And I think what it did show was that the local party wanted somebody who they felt had local knowledge, was capable of representing Wigan people in Parliament from a base of good local knowledge, living in the constituency, working in that constituency for over 25 years. That doesn't say anything about the other candidates. They were all excellent candidates, as I understand it, but I think the local people wanted a local person to represent them.
Where where would you describe yourself on the political spectrum, being in the left, in the centre? I mean, New Labour, Old Labour, how do you describe yourself?
Exactly as it says on my ballot paper, the Labour Party candidate.
Mr Turner, thank you very much indeed. And that's all from us here at Wigan at the moment with the successful Labour Party candidate, Mr Neil Turner.
Laura, thanks very much indeed. Well, John Bartle from Essex University is with me. Like all those political parties, they'll be number crunching. You've been number crunching. What do you actually make of that Wigan result? You heard the candidate, he's quite pleased, obviously, but what do you actually make of the figures that I think we're going to see now on a graphic there? There you see the majority, 6,700. Big surprise, do you think, for Labour?
No, not really. Given the reduced turnout and the larger number of candidates, as the candidate has just reminded us, I think that's a pretty good result for Labour. I think they'll be very happy with that, very concerned about Hamilton South. Perhaps Scotland is steadily moving away from Labour at the moment. Who knows?
What about the other two parties there, the Conservatives edging out the Liberal Democrats to take second? This is what, the 7th and 8th by-elections we've had tonight since the general election. Is there anything that you've seen perhaps tonight, a trend that may give William Hague encouragement?
Notionally, of course, that represents a 5% swing to the Conservatives, which would be pretty encouraging for a general election. It's not all the way he needs to go to recover by any means, but it's part of the way, and he'd be quite happy about that. But it's a measure of how far the Conservative Party have fallen in recent years that they celebrate to come a very distant second in a seat like Wigan, where traditionally they have been the rivals to the Labour Party.
Well, let's just compare tonight with that 1997 general election result. There you see I suppose the most startling figure is that majority, 22,000, that has been cut. But in terms of percentage share of the vote, how much has that changed from the relative positions of the party?
Well, Labour's share of the vote's down from around 69% to 59%. The Conservatives have nudged, they've improved. Room for celebration for the Conservative Central Office, they've gone up from 17 to 18%. They've taken an extra 1% of the vote. The Liberal Democrats have improved their vote slightly by about 3% during the by-election. So, all in all, I think Labour will be well pleased with Wigan, given the reduced turnout. The main concern, of course, is turnout.
Well, we put tonight's result back up for you just to be able to contrast for you the differences in those figures. It was always going to be about second place, wasn't it, tonight, for those other two parties?
Sure. And when you look at those figures, just multiply them by approximately 3%, and that will give you an indication of what the result might have been had there been no differential turnout, and turnout would have been at 1997 general election levels.
So at least that constituency, I know the majority was cut, but that seemed to go to plan, more or less what people were expected. Not Hamilton South. The majority there cut massively. Let's look at those figures for the Hamilton South in Scotland for tonight. I think we've got the graphics figure. There it is. Look at that. 556 was what Labour won this constituency in the end tonight. We had a recount from the SNP called for just towards about 11:30. That was very, very tight, wasn't it? Almost the 24% swing that they needed.
Mischievously, I'm looking at the very large support for the Aki's Home Party down at 1,035. If that's a registration of just how proud they were to be Scottish and from Hamilton, then perhaps if those votes would have switched.
Pretty terrible result there too for the Liberal Democrats. I mean, they're in coalition government up there in Scotland, and yet they've been pushed out by that fringe party into 4th or 5th place.
Well, many Liberal Democrats will be looking at results like this and others before, and they'll be thinking, are we being punished for our close association with the Labour Party? And over time, they may become more reluctant to actually be associated with Labour in the future.
Well, let's just contrast with where they had come from, that 1997 result in Hamilton South. There you see they were in 4th place there, so they've been pushed back one spot tonight. But that was a hefty majority, wasn't it? 15,878. Very similar majority to Winnie Ewing's overturning of the majority when she, back in '67, snatched this seat from Labour. That was Annabel Ewing's mother. So we almost saw tonight history repeating itself, didn't we?
We said earlier on that Hamilton has a history of by-election amazing results, and they very, very nearly repeated it for us tonight. I would like to just contrast the turnout, though, that by-election. We don't have any figures on tonight because we didn't have the total number of votes cast, but it's obviously far, far lower than the by-election in 1967, which persuaded 74% of people to turn out and vote. And then in 1978, another by-election, 72% voted. It's massive change.
But just going back to that 67 historical one, because so many people have talked about the similarities. I mean, the similarities is that it's the same family, the Ewing family, fighting the two elections. It's a similar sort of majority they had to overturn. But just about everything else is not similar. We had an economy under Wilson that wasn't doing very well at all. That's not the case now. What do you pinpoint as the reason for such a swing today?
It's very instantaneous evaluations are always a bit tricky, and we shy away from them in political science. I don't think there is an immediately obvious explanation. There may be something wrong with the Labour Party organisation.
But they will be
Scotland.
worried in Millbank, won't they?
Oh, they should be worried in Millbank, but Millbank is full of very old people who may not draw the right conclusions.
And would they be right also to view these two results together more or less as one in terms of the message that they're receiving from the electorate?
No, it's actually it's not an echo from Scotland and England. It's a different message. And Scotland's always been more complicated, more political parties, the nationalist dimension. And as I say, there's evolving in Scotland a brand new party system. And we don't quite know how voters and parties are going to react. Parties are going to have to develop new strategies, new ways of thinking about targeting during by-elections.
One of the analyses when we had the devolution and the move towards the Scottish Parliament was that the nationalist genie was out of the bottle. Do you think tonight is another demonstration of that?
Well, I'm sure Conservative Party Central Office will be claiming that tomorrow in their press releases. They'll be saying the SNP, look, the momentum towards independence, it's inevitable. The Labour Party have destroyed the Constitution. Return to the Conservatives if you want to stay in Britain.
Well, I'm sure the various central offices will be analysing these figures just as we are. For the moment, John Bartle, thanks very much. Well, we're going to pause just for a moment and squeeze in a bit of weather for you. Here's Carol Kirkwood.
Thank you, Matthew. Well, today we're being dominated by low pressure and its various fronts. So once again, we're in a showery regime. Now, if you look around the centre of the low pressure, there's not much in the way of wind. So, for example, in Northern Ireland and southwest Scotland, the showers could be heavy and quite persistent. Down in the south, though, the isobars are that bit closer together, so the wind should drive the showers along. But it is going to be damp again, and we could see some thunder and lightning and hail. Now, by tomorrow, low pressure is still very much in charge. The isobars are slackening out, though. So again, it's not going to be as windy as indeed it has been. So the showers again that we're going to see will be rather slow moving. And by Sunday, a bit of an improvement, not much in the way of isobars and the chance of some showers in some central parts of England and also into the southeast. Now we've seen a fair few showers rattling across the British Isles in the last 12 hours or so, some heavy ones mixed in and amongst it. So if we take a look, first of all, in Scotland, you can see just round about Crean-Larich, we've had some heavy pulses, similarly so in the northeast of England around Newcastle. Moving back down to Wales as well, where you see the red area, it tells us just where the heaviest bursts have been and also the yellows. And finally down into the southwest, you can see how they're pushing away, but still a lot of showers out in the Bristol Channel. So if we have a look at the picture for later on this morning, any patchy mist and fog that's formed overnight should readily disappear, and then through central and eastern Scotland, generally we're looking at a dry and bright start, maybe even the odd glimpse of sunshine. Similarly so down the eastern side of England, but the showers from the overnight period already in western and southern areas continuing to move over towards the east through the course of the day, and once again some of them merging together to give longer periods of rain. We may even see some hailstones and also thunder and lightning. So if you are out and about, do take extra care, particularly so on the roads where there'll be a lot of surface water and spray around, reducing visibility. So temperatures for later on, well, ranging from about 14 degrees Celsius in the Northern Isles to a warmer 21 degrees Celsius down in the southeast. Now let's go back and join Matthew.
Carol, thanks very much indeed. You're watching BBC News 24. We'll have more analysis of the two by-election results in just a moment. First, though, let's have a summary of all today's news with Joanna Gosling.
Thanks, Matthew. In the last half hour, Labour candidates have been declared the winners in the parliamentary seats of Hamilton South and Wigan. The result in Wigan came first.
And I do hereby declare that the said Neil Turner has been duly elected to serve as a member for this constituency. Thank you very much.
Neil Turner declared himself very pleased with the result despite a turnout of just 25%.
Well, I think the share of the vote is disappointing, but you have to recollect that this is 2 years into a government which is very, very popular. This is a very strong seat, we had difficulty persuading our voters that it was really worth their while turning out. And one of the difficulties we had was at the last 2 hours of the day, we had this tremendous downpour, which just put immediately after people are having their tea. Traditionally, that's when Wigan people go out and vote quite heavily, and obviously they were decided to stay at home.
After a recount at Hamilton, Labour's Bill Tynan was declared the winner. He held the seat by just 556 votes.
So Bill Tynan, the elected Labour candidate, coming to the rostrum for his victory speech. Loud cheers, of course, from the Labour camp.
Now let's take a quick look at the other main news stories tonight. Shots have been fired close to British Gurkhas who were in East Timor as part of the United Nations peacekeeping force. No one was hurt, but the peacekeepers have been facing difficulties establishing control. The Indonesian government has now lifted martial law in the province, effectively transferring power to the UN peacekeepers. The Australian general in charge of the operation wants the remainder of his force to arrive in East Timor as soon as possible. Meanwhile, 15,000 demonstrators have clashed with police outside the Indonesian parliament in Jakarta. They were protesting against a new government bill that gives more power to the military in a state of emergency. Protesters began throwing rocks at police when their route to the parliament building was blocked. Victims of one of Britain's worst water poisoning cases at Camelford in North Cornwall suffered considerable damage to their brain function. A report in the British Medical Journal says studies carried out on people affected after aluminium sulfate entered the water supply showed their symptoms were caused by pollution and not anxiety as had been claimed. A strike by junior doctors has been averted after a last-minute deal was agreed with the government. Doctors would have been balloted on industrial action if no solution had been reached. Under the new agreement, doctors will not work more than 56 hours a week and will get better pay for working overtime. The British scientist who pioneered a new treatment which could delay or even reverse the menopause has said it's too early to say if it could have widespread use. The method, devised by Professor Roger Gosling of Leeds University, was used by American surgeons on a 30-year-old woman who'd gone through a premature menopause. The woman's own ovarian tissue, which had previously been removed, was replaced in an operation which appears to have restored her fertility. The Ford Motor Company has apologised to a worker at its Dagenham plant after he suffered years of racial abuse. Sukhjit Pamar was threatened with physical assault and had graffiti scrawled on his pay packet. The Transport Workers Union said it was the worst case of racial discrimination it had ever come across. Ford said it was in discussions to reach a mutually agreeable settlement after Mr Pamar won his industrial tribunal. Detectives in Suffolk have been questioning a man they arrested in connection with the disappearance of missing teenager Vicky Hall. Vicky, who is 17, has not been seen since the early hours of Sunday morning. She was walking from a nightclub in Felixstowe to her home in nearby Trimley St Mary. Police say a 21-year-old man was arrested on suspicion of abduction. Teachers in England and Wales are to have their pay linked to how well their pupils perform. The Education Secretary David Blunkett said the move was aimed at raising standards in the classroom. He said there would be extra rewards linked to improvements in individual pupils, whatever their ability. But some teachers are opposing the proposals. The NASUWT union says they're unfair and divisive because some staff have brighter pupils than others. That's all from me for now. Back to Matthew for the by-election news.
Thanks very much indeed. Well, let's go back to Wigan, where we heard from the winning candidate talking to Laura Trevelyan a little earlier. Well, I gather she's got another of the candidates with her. Over to you now, Laura.
Well, that's right, Matthew. I've got with me the second-place Conservative candidate, Mr Tom Peat, who actually did rather well. There was a swing to the Conservatives of 5%. So, Mr Peat, what do you put your rather better-than-usual performance down to?
Hard work.
Hard work, and
Yeah.
any particular policies?
Well, we've taken the Conservative message to the people of Wigan energetically. We've been well received on the doorstep. There's no no-go areas for the Conservative Party these days. We've been to every part of this constituency. And I said at the beginning of this campaign, we were going to fight it energetically. During the campaign, various other parties have talked about opinion polls putting me in 4th and 5th place. There isn't a tradition in this town of the Conservatives not finishing in 2nd place. It's only happened once in the last few years. We fought very hard I've had the full support of William Hague and the Shadow Cabinet. Under William Hague, this party has no no-go areas, and I'm proud to be the Conservative candidate and maintain our second place.
But you just said there, Mr. Pete, that there hasn't been a Conservative tradition here in Wigan. That's because you've ignored the place for 18 years. You haven't bothered to canvass. That's what one of your party workers was telling me tonight. I mean, surely it's your own fault you didn't do even better tonight because you've ignored the place for so long.
Well, I can't speak about the last 18 years. All I can speak about is the last 3 weeks. And I can assure you and the people of Wigan that the Conservative Party are taking this town seriously, and we will be fighting all the local elections next year, and we have fought it positively. One of the difficulties we have in a town like this and in a by-election like this is people always look at the majority and say, well, is it worth going out to vote? Well, tonight we've cut the majority, we've got a swing to us. We've now, in the near future, and certainly in the 2 years or that leading up to the next election, we've got to prove to the people of Wigan that it is worth voting. It is worth voting Conservative. The one issue that's been uppermost on everybody's mind is saving the pound. There is only one party that can save the pound, and that's the Conservative Party with William Hague as Prime Minister.
But even with your Save the Pound message, which you say was very popular, the turnout was only 25%, which is shockingly low, isn't it?
It's dreadful. And I would appeal to all the people, not just in Wigan, to take politics seriously. You know, I mean, politicians of all levels spend a lot of people's money, and they should take it seriously. One of the presiding officers said to me in one of the polling stations at 4 o'clock that no one had been in his polling station today under 50. Now, there is something seriously wrong, and it's for all parties to persuade people to vote.
But it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you brought William Hague down here, you brought Michael Portillo down here, you had 28 MPs. I mean, it's not like you ran a low-profile, lacklustre campaign, and yet still people weren't turning out. I mean, there's something very strange going on, isn't there?
Well, it's difficult to assess why people don't turn out in a by-election. One of the good things about this by-election is that the candidates, or most of the candidates, we didn't throw insults at one another. We talked politics, which was refreshingly new. And certainly, as far as I'm concerned, as a Wiganer, delighted that we fought on policies and not on personalities. But the Conservative Party in Wigan have maintained the second place. What we've now got to do is convince the people of Wigan, in larger numbers than they've done today, that it's worthwhile voting for a Conservative candidate. Whether it's me or someone else in 2 years' time, then that's up to the Conservatives in Wigan.
Tom, Pete, thanks very much indeed. And that's all from us here in Wigan just for the moment, where Labour have retained the seat with a majority over the Conservatives of nearly 8,000.
Laura, just before you go, you were talking there about the low turnout figures. You also were covering that by-election in Leeds where it fell beneath 20%. Do you have any pinpointing of the reasons why the turnouts have been so low recently?
Well, those two seats are quite similar. Leeds Central in June was 19.6%. Here it's been 25%. But interestingly, another by-election I covered in July in the same region in Edisbury, the turnout was 52%. And what's interesting is Edisbury was a very close race. It was a very tight race between Labour and the Conservatives. People thought this is worth turning out, it's worth a fight, and the turnout was 52%. Leeds Central, a Labour's heartland. Here in Wigan, another absolute Labour stronghold. People obviously just don't feel it's really worth the effort. Labour voters don't feel there's a threat. They also, perhaps to a certain extent, feel that this government isn't necessarily doing what they want. So I think an interesting message coming out. You know, Labour voters are saying to the government, we don't think it's really worth voting. But in Edisbury, which was a seat where Labour doesn't traditionally do very well, they did exceptionally well. So quite an odd message, really. It shows that perhaps in areas, Middle England, people are turning out to vote Labour, which of course is just what the government wants. But their traditional supporters are staying at home. So overall, a mixed message.
And what do you think the message at Central Office will be from these results?
Well, they'll be very pleased, of course. They'll be saying it's all down to the fact they're running a very strong Save the Pound campaign. But you have to remember that this is on a very low turnout. So it's difficult to read an enormous amount into it from the Conservative side. I mean, sure, there's been a swing of 5% to them, which is very good. They ran a very energetic campaign. They had William Hague down here. They had Michael Portillo down here. They really took it seriously, whereas in the past here in Wigan, they haven't. So, I mean, you know, what they'll be saying is it shows what can be done when we take a campaign seriously. But obviously, the fact they didn't take it that seriously in the past doesn't really say that much for them. OK,
Laura Trevelyan there in Wigan. Thanks very much indeed. Well, still here with me in the studio is John Bartle from Essex University. You've been looking at the figures in slightly more detail, the share of the vote, the percentage vote. You've heard the analysis from the various politicians. What is your analysis of what you think is going on?
Well, if I were a Labour MP looking at these results tonight, I'd be quite happy with the result in the end. There were a large number of candidates which inevitably diminished the share of the vote for the major parties, and Labour's share of the vote was down by around 10%. So I'd be quite happy with those results.
The Conservative candidate you heard just now was talking about his pleasure at seeing it going up 5%, I think it was the figure. I mean, they've got an awful lot of work to do, given the 1997 starting point that they're actually clawing back. No real sign of the recovery that William Hague is looking for.
No real sign at all. I was actually very, very interested to hear the interview with the Conservative there. To say that on the doorsteps people talked about saving the pound as a large issue. The people that actually would speak to Conservatives were probably Conservatives anyway, and the Conservatives that spoke to them merely echoed what they knew that politicians were talking about, saving the pound. I don't think they should draw too many inferences from doorstep conversations. I'd like to make another point about turnout, which is, of course, there were many safe seats in the 1950s and 1960s. Typically mining constituencies for Labour, rural constituencies for Conservatives. They weren't close-run elections, but people turned out and voted. Turnout was high, 70% regularly in by-elections, even though the result was usually not in question.
OK, John Bartle, thanks very much indeed. Well, the more interesting result of the two is definitely the Hamilton South result. Labour winning that with just a tiny majority, just over 600 from the SNP. In Hamilton South is John Pienaar, our political correspondent. What are they saying, John, there to Labour?
Well, Matthew, Labour putting on the best possible front, but I think there's no denying that they will run a very close race here in Hamilton. I think far closer than anyone, I'm sure, including them, expected. Now, to discuss that, I've been joined by John Reid, the Scottish Secretary. And let's ask you, Dr. Reid, how do you account for this? This was a lot tighter than you might have hoped.
Well, how do I account for what? The fact that we won, because we worked every day for every vote, as I said we would. Because we treated the people of Hamilton with respect, and because we were running on a field.
You can't claim to be a happy man this morning, surely, Dr. Reid, after a result as close as that.
John, I'm delighted. We've got another 2 Labour MPs tonight. We had here, as you know, the smallest electorate in mainland Britain, with a very low turnout, 41%. 12 candidates. The local football team got 1,000 candidates, 1,000 votes, and there was a degree, of course, as we went through the doors, of people saying, yes, we'll be voting for your man, but he's a shoo-in. Because people were reasonably content.
But they didn't turn out to vote for your man in anything like the kind of numbers you would have hoped. So how do you account for that kind of lack of response?
Well, that's precisely the point I'm making. We're in mid-term. The vast majority of people that we met on the doors were content with the Labour government, but assumed, I didn't ask them to assume, they assumed that Labour would romp home. And of course what happens in these mid-term by-elections is that all sorts of protest votes come out. And in a normal by-election, if there was 1,000 for the local football team and 2,000 for one of the fringe parties, excuse me, that would be, 5% of the electorate. Here, because of the size of the constituency, it's 15%.
But at the very least, surely you're looking at something of a problem of motivating your core support. The SNP did manage to get a fair number of their own core supporters out.
John, I'm looking at a new Labour member of Parliament. The question should be asked of the SNP, who told us that this was where they were going to reverse the Labour tide. Once again, they were going to win. They had the whole of the history. They even had the same name as their famous 67 electorate. They lost again. They lost the Scottish elections. They lost when they promised they would be free in '93. They lost in the general election. They've lost tonight. So Alex Salmond will no doubt crow, and as long as he's crowing about defeats, I'm quite content to be tranquil about the victories. This is another one tonight, another 2 Labour MPs, and the people of Hamilton will be well served by Bill 10.
Yeah, but surely too many more victories on this scale and you'll be a prematurely grey man. I mean, it was a nervous night for Labour. They thought they were going to do better than this.
No, if you get victories, you get victories. Who do you remember came second in the Paisley by-election? Can you name it? Do you know who came second in the Perth and Kinross by-election? Can you name it?
I think you were writing a prediction, were you not, that Alex Salmond is going to be crowing tomorrow. He's got a fairly happy tale to tell. A Labour massive majority to reduce to within an ace of something really quite spectacular.
John, if Alex Salmond got half the votes of the Hamilton academicals, he would be crowing. This is a man who uses every defeat as a platform for proing. But if he is to go to the SNP conference and explain again that they lost after the Scottish elections, after the general election, after the by-elections, here is a Labour Party mid-term when the last government
Dr. Reid,
lost
have to stop you there, putting obviously the best possible face on a really quite dramatic result, but with that, back to you now in the studio.
John, just before you go, you're saying there the best political gloss from the Labour Party, no surprise there, but there will be shock at the result, wasn't it? The narrowing of the majority to just a few hundred.
Presentationally, I think Labour have to accept that this is a far tougher result than anything that they might have hoped for tonight. Certainly, Dr. John's point must be taken aboard. There must have been a good deal of complacency out there among that core Labour electorate, given the size of the majority, given the fact that none of the polls, none of the pundits were expecting a result on this kind of scale. Even so, Dr. Reid's further prediction that Alex Salmond is going to be grinning broadly at his party conference later on in the day, I think is quite accurate.
It takes the pressure off Alex Salmond, though, doesn't it? There were questions even about his leadership, certainly about his strategy, but a result like that certainly eases the pressure on him.
No, I think he'll look like a happy man somewhere. He must have taken some of the pressure off, even taking into account all the perfectly fair arguments on either side of the question, the fact of voter fatigue, the fact of complacency among Labour voters, rather than out-and-out disillusionment. At the end of the day, presentation counts for a great deal, and he has a happier tale to tell to present before his troops in Inverness than he might have expected.
OK, John Pienaar there at Hamilton South, thanks very much indeed. Well, the new MP for Hamilton South, Bill Tynan, has just given his reaction to his victory.
Well, it was a win. It was a win for the Labour Party and a win for Bill Tynan tonight.
Why did it come so close? Why was it so narrow?
Well, I think that the situation is that when we went to the doorstep, people were happy with what the Labour Party is doing.
Oh, you're not giving us that old one that they didn't vote for you because they were contented. You tried that in North East Scotland.
They were happy with what the way the economy is going, the way the Labour government has acted. And I think people believed that they were telling me this was going to be easy. We did not take that view. What we said is this is a by-election, we have to fight for every vote, and we did that. The campaign team, I must congratulate, because what we did is we took it to the doorsteps, we took it into the streets, and at the end of the day, the Labour Party won this by-election.
But Mr Tynan, I mean, you know, geese peace to use a West of Scotland phrase. I mean, you almost lost the by-election, and you're attributing that to the fact that the people were utterly contented with the Labour government.
No,
That's just
what I'm saying is they took the opportunity. There was a couple of novelty parties in this by-election, and they took the luxury of voting for those novelty parties. Now, I believe at a general election, then people will realise the importance of that, and I think they'll, you know, the majority tonight, although it was slim, I think the fact that we won this was very, very important. It was sending a signal, as far as I'm concerned, that Labour government's in good heart, and we certainly will continue to fight for every vote. I believe that over the next year and a half or 2 years, whenever a by-election is called, I'll prove my worth to the electorate in Hamilton South.
Well, that's Bill Tynan there speaking a few minutes ago. Annabel Ewing, the SNP candidate for Hamilton South, has also been given her reaction to the result to the BBC's Scotland editor, Brian Taylor.
Well, it was a sensational result for the SNP tonight. In Labour's fifth safest seat in Scotland, we have reduced the Labour majority from 16,000 to under 600. I think in anybody's book that is a sensational result.
You must have regrets that you didn't make that final push or that final punt of your message to get you over the top into victory.
We, of course, campaigned very hard in this campaign. We only had 3 weeks, which was fixed by the Labour Party, and for obvious reasons in terms of the result. But we really got a sensational result here tonight. As I say, this is was the fifth safest seat that Labour had in Scotland, and the majority is now under 600. Every Labour seat in Scotland must now be viewed as a marginal seat.
Do you agree with your brother that you were cheated of victory tonight?
Well, I think certainly the result was very, very close, and obviously it is, you know, a disappointment not to win. But by the same token, as I've said, it really is a sensational result for us, and everybody knows it.
Annabel Ewing there speaking to the BBC a short while ago. Well, I'm joined here in the studio still by Dr. John Bartle from the Essex University's Government Department. Hearing there, she says it's a sensational result. It was almost the 24% turnaround that they needed, wasn't it?
They came very, very close, and the SNP have done very well in retaining the support that they had in 1997. Just looking at the numbers, not the individuals, we have no information on how individuals switched between 87 and 99. The SNP retained 94% of its support from the 1997 general election, just comparing the vote today with their vote 2 years ago.
Well, let's compare those figures. Let's pick up a graphic here of that 1997 original graphic, and there you see Labour out there in the red, a long, long way ahead, a majority of 15,000, and there you see today it clawed back and how tight it was between Labour and the SNP. You were just talking about how the parties actually hung on to their 1997 results.
Yeah, the SNP retained 94% of their support in terms of numbers. Labour, an abysmal 36%. 36% is a very, very low figure, very worrying for Labour. But they should take some comfort from the fact that the Conservatives managed to do even worse, and their share of their 1997 vote goes down to 25%, which is similar to the Liberal Democrats.
Another poor night for the Conservatives, but an even worse night for the Liberal Democrats.
Yes, they may have been affected by the existence of these joke parties, the local reasons to support, and there may be some truth that these attracted the support of people, perhaps Labour supporters or SNP supporters, that thought the by-election was beyond the reach of their parties or whatever. So it's a very strange result, very difficult to interpret given the low turnout. We still don't have precise figures to see how low turnout went, but it's a very difficult one to analyse immediately. I think the people in Central Office and Millbank will take time to look at these results.
Well, the full figures are still coming into us. When they do, we'll have more analysis. John Bartle, thanks very much for the moment. We're going to squeeze in a bit of weather in the meantime. Here's Carol Kirkwood.
And we won this by-election. That's what's important at the end of the day.
What do you feel about the turnout? Did you feel you had a good, a lot of people there, plenty of enthusiasm and so on?
Well, I think the situation is that this is about the fifth election this year. People may be suffering from voter fatigue, but the fact is that we won this by-election. That's what's important at the end of the day.
And how does it start tomorrow? Presumably you're up early and getting on with the job. What's going to be your first job in the new office?
Well, my first job is to open a constituency office here in Hamilton, to make myself accessible to the people here and to make sure that I respond to the problems that they have.
Well, good luck with that. Thank you very much indeed for taking time out. I know a busy evening for you, but again, congratulations. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Suzanne.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
The water poisoning at Camelford. You still came third behind the Conservatives.
Well, that's right. All our activists were in Harrogate. And on Tuesday, there were 28 Conservative MPs here. And it hasn't done them any good.
Why didn't you bring all your 46 MPs over from Harrogate just for the morning? Might have made a difference, mightn't it?
Well, it might have done, but they had very important work to do in Harrogate. And obviously there was nothing more important for 28 Conservative MPs to be doing, and it hasn't done them any good in the ballot box whatsoever. We're very pleased. We've increased our votes. The Conservatives are down 17% on their European election result in Wigan. Of course we're delighted.
What would you say the main issue was on the doorstep, or was there one? Was it just apathy?
Well, there clearly was a lot of apathy, but I think more of the Wigan people than just to say that they were lazy and not going to the vote. They clearly didn't feel that they wanted to vote for this Labour Party, that they have done so in Wigan for getting on for 80 years now. We pushed very strongly the fact that in Britain, since 1997, when Labour took power, there is over 1,000 less policemen on the beat, and I think people were very concerned about that.
But do you worry that perhaps your policies and your image is not quite as distinct from Labour as it once was, and that this policy Paddy Ashdown and now Charles Kennedy are pursuing of working with Labour at Westminster is hurting you electorally?
Well, I can't possibly worry about that because we've increased our vote today. We've pointed out to the people of Wigan that there are less police on the street, that waiting lists, when you consider waiting lists to getting on waiting lists, are longer, and that class sizes for most children are up since May 1997, and having pointed out all of those things, all of those Labour failures, we've got a higher vote.
But isn't the real issue here the turnout? Doesn't that worry you? 25% turnout in this by-election, one of the lowest since the Second World War.
Well, it worries all politicians, I'm sure, but it's a very, very damning indictment of the Labour Party, and that this is one of the strongest seats they have in the country, and 75% of the people here didn't feel enthused enough about the government that finally they have, that is Labour, to even come out and vote for them. They obviously don't feel that enthusiastic about their policies.
Jonathan Rule, third place Liberal Democrat, thanks very much indeed. And that's all from us from Wigan for the moment. Matthew.
Laura, thanks very much indeed. Well, here in the studio with me, watching all of these results all through the evening, is Dr. John Bartle from Essex University. All the candidates, not surprisingly, saying they're well happy with the result. Who do you think will be happiest?
Oh, well, it's a dichotomy tonight. In Scotland, the SNP will be delighted, narrowly failing to win a seat, which is a very safe Labour seat. And in England, I think the Wigan result is a very good result for Labour. I think they can be quite content with it.
Well, let's just look at that result in a slightly more detail, that Wigan result, because that is what happened in 1997. You see Labour well out in front, a huge majority. And let's just see what happened today. It was pegged back, but still a majority of what, almost 7,000 that Neil Turner won in the end. So they'll be happier there, won't they, compared to what happened in Hamilton South?
I think that's a good, solid result for the Labour Party in England. They'll be far more concerned with the Scottish result. I'd also like to sort of comment on the way in which the government is also blamed for the low turnout. In fact, voters, by not turning out, are rejecting all the parties.
But they've had a lot of elections, haven't they, the voters in recent times? You've had the local elections, you've had the European elections, now these elections. In Scotland, they also had the new Scottish Parliament elections. It's, I suppose, not that surprising that there's somewhat of a fatigue.
Yeah, sure. And there are plans for more elections on the way, more local referendums, potentially referendums over regional government in the future. People may find that democracy just gets in the way of their video watching and their watching of TV. It may become just too much for most people.
Is that something that all the parties will be concerned about, do you think?
I think they should be. I think they should be. There may be ways of rolling into the same ballot different questions. But of course, most people want them to focus on a specific issue at a certain time because these are big, important issues. But here's the irony. The people are being handed the power and they seem to be putting it to one side and failing to use it. I think this calls into question a lot of Labour's assumptions about the constitutional reform package.
OK, more from you in a short while. John Bartle for now, thanks very much indeed. Well, there'll be more analysis.
In Hamilton South, a huge surge in the Scottish National Party vote saw the Labour majority reduced by 15,500. In the other by-election in Wigan, it was more straightforward, Labour's Neil Turner winning with a comfortable majority.
Bill Tynan, Scottish Labour Party candidate, 7,100.
Victory for Labour, but a narrow one. The Scottish Nationalists having managed to slash their majority by nearly 15,000. But Labour insisted they were happy with the result.
We had a situation where, as far as people are concerned, this is the fifth or fourth election we've had this year. So there was an element, I believe, of voter fatigue. But the situation is that we're the winners in this election.
But the SNP said the close result showed how disillusioned voters were with New Labour.
I think people are fed up with New Labour. They want somebody going to Westminster to speak up for them, which is clearly not the case with a Labour backbencher who will simply do what Tony tells him to do.
A good night for the SNP. For the Liberal Democrats, though, it was a humiliating evening. They crept in sixth place, even beaten by a candidate who campaigned for the local football team. Labour have attributed their narrow win to the voters' usual mid-term apathy. In this by-election, though, it's the Liberal Democrats who've been given real pause for thought. Rona Dougal, Sky News, Hamilton.
Even before the result was officially announced, Labour supporters greeted their candidate as the clear victor. It was plain to see from the counting tables that Neil Turner had overwhelmingly the lion's share of the ballot. Only 1 in 4 voters bothered to go to the polling booths on a wet and windy day in Wigan. And though Labour's percentage is down, the new MP's gratified by the result at this stage of the electoral cycle.
This time in our last Labour government, in the 74-79 Labour government, we were losing seats like Workington to the Conservatives, rock-solid Labour seats with swings of over 20%. Here we are, 2 years into Tony Blair's government, and we're holding on to our seats, holding on to our votes, and trouncing the Conservatives and the Liberals all over the place.
The Conservatives threw everything they had into this campaign and increased their share of the vote by 1%, remaining a poor second to Labour.
I am disappointed. I wanted to be the Member of Parliament for Wigan. It's a seat I fought twice. I always wanted to represent the people of Wigan. Unfortunately, the people of Wigan today have decided that Neil Turner is the next MP.
But the Liberal Democrats refused to be bowed by their result, up 4%, but still in third place.
It is a rock-solid Labour town, and 3/4 of the people in it simply did not feel enthused enough about their natural party to even come out and vote for them, and that has to be a concern for them.
As Labour had feared, its supporters simply didn't bother turning out in such a safe seat. But the Tories can only be buoyed up that they've retained their position in in second place, and the Liberal Democrats disappointed that they didn't manage to push them out. Judith Dawson, Sky News, Wigan.
The party is celebrating today after taking Labour to the brink in the Hamilton South by-election. Labour's candidate Bill Tynan only just managed to cling on to the Hamilton South seat with a drastically slashed majority. Labour's vote dropped to a mere 7,172, while the Scottish National Party came in with 6,616 votes. The Scottish Socialists got 1,847 votes, leaving Labour with a slim majority of 556. Linda Kennedy reports.
Labour have a new MP in Hamilton South, but Bill Tynan was neither sure-footed today nor on his way to victory. In their fifth safest seat in Scotland, they only squeezed home. The Scots Secretary tried to explain why.
I'm content to only win and take it modestly, and like Alex Salmond, only be defeated time after time and crow about it.
It took a recount last night to separate Labour from the SNP before finally a declaration could be made.
I declare that Bill Tynan has been duly elected to serve as a Member of Parliament for the Hamilton South constituency.
Relief from Labour as he realised it was so close. Always critical of the hasty campaign here, the SNP candidate said with more time they'd have done better.
I think certainly if we had had a wee bit longer, perhaps we could have closed the gap even further. Obviously the Labour Party were very worried and wanted to close down the by-election.
And for Labour's coalition partners, the Lib Dems, it was a very bad night. They came sixth, behind even a party seeking a new ground for Hamilton Accies Football Club. This was the first chance to test Scotland's political temperature since devolution, and Labour hoped the Scottish Parliament would show the nationalist genie was back in the bottle. The low turnout clearly helped the SNP, but the strength of their showing allows them to argue that their cause is still very much alive. Linda Kennedy, ITN, Hamilton.
And our correspondent Harry Smith joins us from the SNP conference in Inverness now. Well, Harry, an air of considerable satisfaction there, I suppose.
Quite a party's been going on here this morning and into the early hours. You could be forgiven wandering around here for thinking that the SNP had actually won this seat. Now, Hamilton has great historical significance for the Scottish National Party. 32 years ago, Winnie Ewing won a famous victory in Hamilton against the sitting Labour government and went to Westminster as the Nationalists' only MP. The candidate who came second last night was her daughter Annabel. She came very close to making history repeat itself, and one of the most amazing things is that nobody seems to have predicted it. When I was in the constituency earlier in the week, Labour seemed confident of holding on to this with a good majority, and so they should have been confident. They called the timing of the election to coincide with the Scottish National Party conference. They also threw everything into this contest, including the Prime Minister and 6 of his cabinet colleagues. They should have done better.
Now, this afternoon it's the leader's speech there. What will Alex Salmond be talking about?
Well, you can be sure he'll congratulate the party on the result last night. Annabel Ewing is expected to arrive here shortly, and I think he's going to introduce her to the delegates. You can be sure that she'll get a magnificent welcome. But I think he'll then ask them to look beyond this result. This is only one by-election. I think what he's going to say to them is, look, the party have come a long way in the last year. They've gone from being a tiny group at Westminster to being the official opposition in the Scottish Parliament. Now, history shows that oppositions have a habit of becoming governments. And I think he'll ask them to aim for that, to look towards the next election and make sure that they are the party of government next time.
Harry Smith in Inverness, thank you very much.
And with a turnout of just 25%, Labour's majority in the Wigan by-election took a nosedive yesterday. Labour's Neil Turner won 9,641 votes. The Conservative candidate, Tom Preet, took 2,912, and the Liberal Democrats' Jonathan Rule got 2,148. Labour's thumping general election majority of 22,642 was slashed to just 6,729.
A boy of 6 has been